Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The Arizona desert in August isn't a place for mistakes. And at 31, I thought I knew better than to make them. I'd been living in Phoenix for about 3 years, working as a freelance photographer, and the outdoors had become my second office. Every weekend I'd hit different trails with my camera, building up my portfolio of southwestern landscapes. When I found the Desert Wanderers group on Facebook, it seemed perfect. Organized hikes to remote locations most tourists never see, with people who actually knew what they were doing. That Saturday morning, I loaded my backpack with what I thought was plenty of water, 3 liters, plus my camera gear, some protein bars, sunscreen, and a lightweight jacket. The group leader, a weathered guy named Frank who'd been hiking these trails for decades, had emphasized bringing extra water, but I figured 3 liters would be more than enough for a 5-hour hike. We met at a gas station off Highway 60 at 5 in the morning, trying to beat the worst of the heat. There were 8 of us total, a mix of experienced hikers and intermediates like myself. Frank went over the route, a 12-mile loop through a canyon system that would take us past some ancient petroglyphs and natural springs. He made everyone show their water supplies, nodding approvingly at most, but raising an eyebrow at mine. 3 liters might be cutting it close, he said, his voice gravelly from years of desert air. But the gas station was already closed, and I assured him I'd be fine, that I'd done plenty of desert hikes before. The first hour was magical. The sunrise painting the rocks in shades of orange and pink that my camera couldn't quite capture, though I tried with every shot. The group moved at a steady pace, and I found myself constantly stopping to photograph the way the light hit the canyon walls. The intricate patterns in the sand, the lonely barrel cacti standing like sentinels against the brightening sky. Around 7:30, we reached a narrow section of the trail where massive boulders created these incredible shadow patterns across the red dirt. I had to get the shot. The contrast was perfect, almost surreal, like nature's own art installation. I told the person nearest to me, a woman named Diane who worked as a nurse in Scottsdale, that I'd catch up in just a minute. She nodded and kept walking, her bright blue pack disappearing around a bend while I crouched down, adjusting my camera settings to capture the interplay of light and shadow. Through my viewfinder, I noticed a side trail leading up to what looked like a natural arch formation about 50 yards away. The morning light was hitting it at just the right angle, creating this golden glow that wouldn't last another 20 minutes. Without really thinking about it, I scrambled up the rocky path, my hiking boots sliding slightly on the loose gravel, determined to get what could be the perfect shot for my portfolio. The arch was even more spectacular up close, and I spent maybe 15 minutes shooting from different angles, completely absorbed in my work. When I finally lowered my camera and looked around, the silence hit me first. No voices, no footsteps on gravel, no sounds of other hikers. The main trail below seemed empty in both directions, and I realized with a quick spike of annoyance that the group hadn't waited for me. I scrambled back down to the main trail, choosing to go right because that's where we'd been heading. But after 10 minutes of quick walking, I still hadn't caught up. The trail split into 2 paths near a cluster of tall saguaro cacti, and I stood there, sweat already beading on my forehead despite the early hour, trying to remember if Frank had mentioned anything about a fork. My phone showed no signal, just a useless emergency calls only message, and I hadn't thought to download offline maps because I was supposed to be with a group the entire time. I chose the left path, reasoning that it seemed more worn, which meant more foot traffic, which meant it was probably the main trail. But after another 20 minutes of increasingly rapid hiking, the path narrowed and started climbing steeply upward, nothing like the relatively flat loop Frank had described. My first water bottle was already half empty. I'd been sipping constantly in my hurry to catch up, and the temperature was climbing fast. My phone's weather app, one of the few things that worked offline, showed it was already 92 degrees, and it wasn't even 9 o'clock yet. I backtracked to the fork, wasting another 20 minutes in more precious water, then tried the right path. This one seemed more promising at first, winding through a wash with high walls that provided some shade. But after about a mile, it dead-ended at a pile of massive boulders that looked like they'd fallen recently, probably during last month's flash floods. The rational part of my brain said to stay calm, retrace my steps all the way back to where I'd taken the photos, and wait there for the group to notice I was missing and come back for me. But pride and a growing kernel of panic pushed me to keep searching. I climbed up a small ridge to get a better view, hoping to spot the group or at least recognize some landmark from Frank's pre-hike briefing. All I saw was endless desert in every direction. Miles of creosote bushes, ocotillo plants with their spindly arms reaching toward the cloudless sky, and distant mountains shimmering in the heat that was already creating those wavy distortions in the air. My second water bottle was down to a third, and when I checked my phone again, it was 9:47 and showing 101 degrees. The weight of my camera gear, usually barely noticeable, felt like carrying stones in my pack, and my shirt was completely soaked through with sweat that evaporated almost instantly in the dry air. By 11 o'clock, I'd finished my second bottle and was halfway through my third and last one. The temperature on my phone read 109 degrees, and every breath felt like inhaling from a hairdryer. I'd given up on finding the trail and was now focused on basic survival, looking for shade, any shade. But the sun was almost directly overhead, and the scraggly desert plants threw shadows barely bigger than dinner plates. My lips were cracked despite the lip balm I kept applying, and I could feel the beginning of what would become severe sunburn on the back of my neck where my hat didn't quite cover. In the distance, maybe 2 miles away, I could see power lines cutting across the desert, and I knew that power lines meant access roads, which meant potential help. But 2 miles in this heat, with barely any water left, seemed like crossing an ocean. I found a large boulder with a slight overhang and squeezed myself into the strip of shade it provided, my knees pulled up to my chest, trying to make myself as small as possible to fit in the shadow. That's when the real fear set in, the kind that makes your chest tight and your thoughts race in circles. I knew the statistics. People die in the Arizona desert every summer, experienced hikers, tourists, locals who should know better. The heat kills you slowly, first confusion, then hallucinations, then your organs start shutting down one by one. I rationed my last water bottle into tiny sips, just enough to wet my mouth, and tried to do the math on how long I could last. My phone was at 40% battery, still no signal, and I'd turned off everything except emergency services to conserve power. I took off my long-sleeved hiking shirt and wrapped it around my head like a makeshift turban, sitting there in just my sports bra, not caring about modesty anymore, only survival. The rocks around me radiated heat like an oven, and I could actually see the air shimmering and dancing, creating weird mirages that made distant bushes look like pools of water. Around 1 in the afternoon, with the temperature at 112 degrees according to my dying phone, I made the decision to try for the power lines. Staying put meant certain dehydration, and nobody knew where I was. I hadn't even told anyone which specific trail I was hiking that day, just that I was going out with a hiking group. I tore pages from the small notebook I carried for photography notes and left them weighted down with rocks, arrows pointing in the direction I was heading, just in case someone came looking. My water was down to maybe 3 ounces, sloshing pathetically at the bottom of the bottle, and I'd already decided I would drink it all before starting the walk rather than torture myself with the sound of it. The ground burned through my hiking boots, and within 5 minutes of leaving my boulder shelter, I could feel the sun attacking every exposed inch of skin like thousands of tiny needles. I'd draped my jacket over my shoulders and head, creating a pathetic tent of shade that did almost nothing against the assault of heat from above and below. The 2 miles might as well have been 20. Every few hundred yards, I had to stop and rest, crouching down to make myself smaller against the sun, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. My mouth felt like I'd been chewing on cotton, and my tongue was swollen and heavy. Strange thoughts kept flickering through my head. Random memories of ice cream shops, swimming pools, That waterfall shower at the spa I'd visited last year for my birthday. About halfway to the power lines, I stumbled and fell, my palms scraping against the burning rocks, and for a moment I just lay there, wondering if this was how it would end, if some hiker would find my body months from now, mummified by the desert heat. But then I heard it, the distant hum of electricity from the power lines, and even better, the faint sound of an engine. I forced myself up, legs shaking, and stumbled forward, waving my white jacket over my head like a flag, screaming with what little voice I had left, though it came out as more of a croak. It was a utility truck, one of those white pickups with the yellow flashing lights, driving slowly along the access road beneath the power lines. The driver, a guy named Carl who looked about 50 with deeply tanned arms covered in faded tattoos, later told me he almost didn't stop because he thought I was just another desert mirage. But something about the way I was moving, stumbling, and waving that jacket made him hit the brakes. He jumped out of his truck already reaching for his water cooler, and I'll never forget the feeling of that first gulp of cold water. It was like coming back to life, like every cell in my body had been screaming and suddenly went quiet. He poured some over my head and neck, not caring that it was soaking the seats as he helped me into his air-conditioned cab. The thermometer on his dashboard showed 114 degrees outside, and he told me I was lucky. He wasn't supposed to be checking this section until next week, but there'd been reports of copper thieves in the area. Carl drove me straight to the nearest urgent care facility, calling ahead on his radio to let them know he was bringing in someone with heat exhaustion. The nurses hooked me up to IV fluids, and I spent the next 4 hours in a bed with cooling blankets, my core temperature slowly returning to normal while they monitored my kidney function. Frank and the hiking group had realized I was missing when they reached the lunch spot, and had already called search and rescue by the time Carl found me. The doctor, a young woman who'd trained in emergency medicine specifically for desert-related injuries, told me bluntly that another hour or two in that heat without water could have meant organ failure. I still have the scars on my palms from where I fell, pale little reminders that fade a bit more each year. These days, I still photograph the desert, but I never hike alone. I carry 6 liters of water minimum, and I bought a GPS beacon that sends my location to satellites every 10 minutes. That $12 device might seem like overkill to some people, but they didn't spend 3 hours thinking they were going to die alone in the Arizona desert, watching the power lines shimmer in the heat while their bodies slowly shut down. Most people think Montana in October is too cold for backpacking, but that never stopped me from chasing those empty trails when everyone else had packed up for the season. At 32, after spending 6 years guiding tours through Yellowstone, solitude had become my drug of choice. The day everything went sideways started like any other autumn trek. Me, my worn-out Osprey pack, and 40 miles of wilderness between me and the nearest paved road. The Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness stretched out like a massive graveyard of pine and granite, completely deserted except for the animals preparing for winter. My plan seemed bulletproof. 3 days following Slough Creek up to the plateau, photographing the fall colors and maybe spotting some elk before the heavy snows hit. The ranger at the Cook City station had mentioned increased grizzly activity near the berry patches, but honestly, after years of carrying bear spray and never needing it, those warnings had started to feel like background noise. The spot where everything unraveled sat about 11 miles from the trailhead, tucked between 2 ridges where the creek made this perfect S-curve through a meadow. Setting up camp took longer than usual because the ground had already started to freeze, making it nearly impossible to drive tent stakes deep enough to hold against the wind. By the time my little orange shelter stood ready, darkness had swallowed the valley whole, leaving just the circle of light from my headlamp dancing across the frost-covered grass. Dinner consisted of lukewarm instant ramen eaten straight from the pot, while sitting on a fallen log, watching the stars emerge one by one in that crystal-clear mountain sky. The temperature had already dropped below 20 degrees, and every exhale created these little clouds that hung in the air before dissolving. After hanging my food bag on the bear pole 100 yards from camp, standard procedure that had become muscle memory, exhaustion pulled me into my sleeping bag around 8:30, way earlier than usual, but typical for solo trips when there's nothing to do after dark. The breathing woke me up somewhere around 2 in the morning, this deep rhythmic huffing that made the tent walls vibrate with each exhale. My first thought jumped straight to grizzly, that distinctive sound of a large predator investigating something new in its territory. Through the thin nylon, maybe 3 feet from where my head rested against the stuff sack I used as a pillow, came the unmistakable noise of something massive shifting its weight from paw to paw. The bear spray sat right next to my sleeping bag, exactly where training had taught me to keep it, and my fingers found the safety tab in the darkness while trying to control my own breathing. Every wilderness course I'd ever taken screamed the same advice. Stay quiet, don't move. Let the bear lose interest and wander away. Bears investigating tents usually just wanted to satisfy their curiosity before moving on to find actual food. But this one started circling, and each footfall sent vibrations through the frozen ground that I could feel in my chest. Then came the pawing, gentle at first, like a dog scratching at a door, testing the strange orange fabric that had appeared in its territory. The tent pole near my feet bent inward as the animal pressed against it, and I could hear claws catching on the rainfly, creating these tiny ripping sounds that made my teeth clench. My headlamp lay within reach, but turning it on would only confirm my presence inside what probably looked like a giant piece of exotic fruit to a hungry bear preparing for hibernation. The circling continued, methodical and patient, occasionally punctuated by these low grunts that sounded almost conversational, like the bear was talking to itself while solving a puzzle. When it pressed its nose against the tent wall near my torso, leaving a wet mark that gleamed in the starlight filtering through the fabric, every instinct screamed at me to run. But running meant unzipping the tent, which would take precious seconds, and stepping directly into the path of an animal that could cover 30 yards faster than I could blink. The moment arrived when the bear hooked its claws through the mesh window near the door and pulled, tearing a 6-inch gash that let in a rush of freezing air, along with the overwhelming smell of wet fur and rotting meat. That smell. God, nothing prepares you for how a grizzly smells up close, like a mixture of dog kennel, compost heap, and something ancient and wild that triggers every evolutionary alarm in your brain. My thumb pressed down on the bear spray trigger, but nothing happened. The safety tab had come off fine, but the mechanism had completely frozen in the sub-zero temperature, leaving me holding a useless canister while staring at a massive brown snout pushing through the tear in my tent. Panic finally won over training, and my body moved before my brain could stop it. Rolling sideways, I grabbed my flashlight and dove for the back of the tent, using my shoulder like a battering ram to burst through the fabric opposite from where the bear stood. The cold hit like jumping into ice water, but adrenaline kept my legs pumping as I sprinted blindly into the darkness, with only the bouncing beam of my flashlight showing glimpses of trees and rocks. Behind me came the sound of the tent being demolished, poles snapping, fabric shredding, my entire camp destroyed in seconds. The bear's roar echoed off the canyon walls, not the comical sound you hear in movies, but something primal that seemed to come from the earth itself. My bare feet, no time for boots, found every sharp rock and frozen stick as I crashed through the underbrush, following the creek downstream because water meant a clear path and maybe, just maybe, a way to mask my scent. The flashlight beam caught the reflection of eyes behind me, definitely following, maybe 40 yards back, moving with that deceptive casualness that grizzlies have when they're not really trying yet. Blood from my torn feet left a perfect trail in the snow that had started falling earlier, each footprint filling with red before the next step. The creek led to a narrow ravine where the walls pressed in close enough that I could touch both sides with outstretched arms. Scrambling over ice-covered boulders, I heard the bear's breathing getting closer, no longer casual but purposeful, like it had decided this chase had gone on long enough. My flashlight started flickering, the batteries struggling in the cold, throwing crazy shadows that made every rock look like another predator waiting to strike. About 50 yards into the ravine, I found what looked like salvation. A cluster of massive boulders creating a narrow gap maybe 2 feet wide, too small for a full-grown grizzly, but just wide enough for a desperate human. Wedging myself into that crack meant scraping skin off my shoulders and back, but it put solid granite between me and those claws. The bear arrived seconds later, ramming its shoulder against the opening hard enough to shake dust from the rocks above, its frustration evident in the deep growls that reverberated through my hiding spot. For the next 4 hours, until the first gray light of dawn started creeping across the sky, that bear tried everything to reach me. It dug at the base of the rocks, sending showers of gravel into my face. It climbed on top and reached down with paws the size of dinner plates, claws scraping inches from my head when I pressed myself against the back wall. At one point, it left for maybe 20 minutes, the longest 20 minutes of my life, before returning to resume its siege. The cold had moved beyond painful into a weird numbness where I couldn't feel my feet anymore, and violent shivering made it hard to hold the flashlight steady. Hypothermia whispered seductively about how easy it would be to just close my eyes and sleep, but the occasional swipe of claws kept shocking me back to alertness. Around 5 in the morning, with visibility improving, the bear seemed to lose interest, its sounds growing distant until they faded entirely. Still, I waited another hour before crawling out of that crack, every joint screaming in protest after being locked in the same position for so long. The journey back to what remained of my camp took 3 hours on destroyed feet that had turned purple and black from frostbite. Every step felt like walking on broken glass, leaving bloody prints in the fresh snow that had covered the chaos from the night. The campsite looked like a bomb had gone off. Sleeping bags shredded and scattered across 50 yards, tent poles bent into impossible angles, my backpack torn open with freeze-dried meals and clothing strewn everywhere. The bear had even found my water filter and chewed it into plastic confetti. But my satellite emergency beacon, tucked in a side pocket the bear had missed, still worked. Pressing that SOS button felt like admitting defeat after years of priding myself on wilderness self-sufficiency. But pride means nothing when you're looking at toes that might need amputation. While waiting for rescue, I gathered what remained of my gear, stuffing torn clothing against my feet to stop the bleeding, and discovered something that made my chest tighten. Massive paw prints circling the entire meadow, showing the bear had stalked my camp for hours before I woke up. The helicopter arrived just after noon, the search and rescue team's faces shifting from professional calm to genuine concern when they saw the condition of my feet and the devastation around us. During the flight to the hospital in Billings, the paramedic cleaning my wounds mentioned they'd been tracking an aggressive male grizzly in the area, one that had lost fear of humans after too many encounters with careless campers who didn't secure their food properly. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd done everything right, followed every protocol, hung my food exactly as trained, and still ended up as another statistic in human-bear encounters. The doctor at the hospital counted 43 separate lacerations on my feet, some deep enough to require stitches, and confirmed 2 toes would need partial amputation from frostbite. Recovery took 2 months of physical therapy and skin grafts, but the mental recovery stretched much longer. Even now, 5 years later, sleeping in a tent triggers nightmares where I wake up gasping, convinced I can hear that distinctive breathing just outside. The investigation that followed revealed details that still make me sick to think about. Rangers found the bear's daybeds less than 200 yards from where I'd camped, meaning it had watched me set up, cook dinner, and crawl into my tent like I was putting myself in a wrapped gift box. The tracks showed it had approached and retreated from my camp at least 4 times before finally committing to the investigation that woke me up. They eventually had to put the bear down 3 weeks later after it charged a group of hunters near Cook City, and the necropsy revealed something disturbing. Its stomach contained human clothing and gear from at least 2 other camps, though no bodies were ever found. The biologist explained that the bear had learned to associate human camps with easy food rewards, probably from years of successfully raiding improperly stored supplies, and had begun seeing tents themselves as food containers to be opened. What saved me, apparently, was pure luck. The ravine I'd stumbled into while running blind was the only geographical feature for miles that could have provided adequate protection from a determined grizzly. These days, I still guide tours through Yellowstone, but something fundamental has changed in how I move through wild spaces. Every snapping twig makes me pause. Every shadow holds potential danger, and I carry 2 cans of bear spray plus a backup that I keep at body temperature to prevent freezing. When clients ask about my pronounced limp or why I wear special boots to accommodate my modified feet, I tell them the story, watching their faces shift from excitement about spotting wildlife to understanding the reality of sharing space with apex predators. The wilderness isn't malicious or evil. That bear was just being a bear, following instincts honed over thousands of years. But it's not our friend either. Not some Disney movie where respect and proper food storage guarantee safety. Sometimes you do everything right and still end up bleeding in the snow, wedged between rocks while 700 pounds of muscle and claws tries to drag you out. That's the truth they don't put in the camping guides. Nature doesn't care about your training, your experience, or your bear spray. When you step into those mountains, you're accepting that contract, walking into something beautiful and terrible that might just decide to remind you where you really stand on the food chain. College was kicking my ass that November, and when my roommate Jason suggested we skip our Friday classes for a hiking trip up near the Cascade foothills, I jumped at the chance. 22 and stressed about finals, I needed to clear my head more than I needed another lecture on European history. We packed his beat-up Ford Ranger with camping gear we had no intention of using, grabbed some energy bars and bottled water from the campus store, and headed out around dawn. The drive took us 3 hours north through small logging towns where the diners still had wood paneling, and the gas stations only had 2 pumps. Jason kept playing the same indie rock playlist he'd been obsessed with since sophomore year, while I watched the city disappear into Douglas firs and mountain ash. The parking area we picked was just a wide spot where the forestry road turned to gravel. Maybe room for 4 or 5 cars, though ours was the only one there when we pulled in around 9 that morning. The trail started behind a wooden sign so weathered you could barely make out the carved letters announcing Ridgeline Trail Number 7. Jason grabbed his backpack while I tied my bootlaces tighter and pulled on the fleece jacket my mom had sent me the previous month. The path was narrow, covered in pine needles that had turned bronze and slippery from the recent rain, and it switched back through trees so thick that even though the sun was out, everything stayed dim and cold underneath the canopy. We'd been walking for maybe 40 minutes, Jason telling me about this girl from his economics class who kept texting him at 2 in the morning, when we came around a cluster of moss-covered boulders and saw something white fluttering against a huge cedar tree about 20 feet ahead. At first I thought it was trash, maybe toilet paper some asshole hiker had left behind. But as we got closer I could see it was a paper mask, one of those cheap Halloween ones you'd buy at a dollar store, pinned to the bark with what looked like a hunting knife. The mask had eye holes cut out, and a creepy smile drawn on with black marker, and underneath it, stabbed through the same knife, was a folded piece of notebook paper. Jason reached for the note before I could tell him maybe we shouldn't touch it, pulling the paper free, while the knife stayed embedded in the tree trunk. He unfolded it, and we both leaned in to read the message written in the same black marker as the smile on the mask. "Welcome to the game. Take the mask and find the next one, 50 paces north where the fallen oak makes a bridge. Your time starts now." Jason actually laughed, that nervous kind of laugh he did during horror movies when he was pretending not to be scared, and said it was probably some geocaching thing or maybe a scavenger hunt the local college kids set up. The competitive side of him that made him insufferable during board game nights was already kicking in, and before I could suggest we just leave it alone, he'd yanked the knife out of the tree, grabbed the mask, and started counting paces north. I followed because what else was I going to do? Leave him alone out there? But something about the whole setup made my chest feel tight in a way that had nothing to do with the altitude or the hiking. Sure enough, 50 paces through the underbrush brought us to a massive oak tree that must have fallen during a storm years ago, its trunk spanning across a small ravine like nature's own bridge. There on the other side, tied to a branch with orange surveyor's tape, was another paper mask, this one with triangular eyes and a frown drawn in red ink. The note attached to this one said, "Good job. You're learning fast. Next mask is at the clearing where 3 trails meet. Follow the deer path behind the big stump." Jason was getting into it now, putting the first mask in his backpack and reaching across the log to grab the second one, talking about how elaborate this whole thing was and wondering what the prize might be at the end. But when I looked around the forest, trying to spot this deer path the note mentioned, I noticed something that made every muscle in my body go rigid. About 30 yards to our left, partially hidden behind a cluster of young hemlocks, someone in camouflage gear was standing perfectly still, watching us. I grabbed Jason's arm hard enough to make him drop the second mask, and when he started to complain, I just pointed with my chin toward where the person was standing. The figure didn't move when we looked directly at them, didn't wave or call out, or do anything normal people do when they're spotted on a trail. Just stayed there like a statue wearing full hunting camo, including one of those face masks that covers everything except the eyes. Jason whispered that it was probably just a hunter, maybe bow season or something. But hunters don't just stand there staring at people, and this person wasn't carrying any visible weapon, just standing with their arms at their sides in a way that seemed completely unnatural. We both stood there for what felt like forever, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds before Jason loudly said, "Hey there," and gave a wave that the figure didn't return. That's when I noticed the smell, this thick metallic scent that cut through the normal forest smells of dirt and rotting leaves, and I realized it was coming from somewhere past the fallen oak tree, from the direction the game wanted us to go. Jason must have smelled it too because his whole demeanor changed, that cocky attitude draining away as he took a step backward, nearly slipping on the wet leaves. The figure in camo finally moved then, not toward us but parallel to our position, walking through the trees with slow, deliberate steps that somehow didn't make any of the usual sounds you'd expect from someone moving through underbrush. They stopped again maybe 20 yards away, still watching, and that's when we saw the second person, dressed the same way, standing on the opposite side of the trail we'd come from, effectively putting us between them. Jason grabbed my shoulder and hissed that we needed to get back to the truck right now. Forget the stupid game. And we both turned to head back the way we came, trying to walk fast without actually running because some primitive part of your brain tells you that running triggers the chase. But as we passed the cedar tree where we'd found the first mask, we saw a third figure in camouflage. This one standing right on the trail ahead of us, holding something in their gloved hands that looked like another one of those paper masks. We veered off the trail immediately, crashing through salal bushes and devil's club that tore at our clothes and skin, both of us abandoning any pretense of staying calm. Jason dropped his backpack somewhere in those first panicked minutes, and I could hear him gasping these ragged breaths that matched my own as we stumbled over roots and ducked under low-hanging branches. The worst part was the silence behind us. No shouting, no sounds of pursuit, just our own noisy flight through the forest while those figures were probably moving through the trees like smoke, knowing exactly where we were headed. The truck was our only thought: get to the truck, lock the doors, drive until we hit pavement and cell service and people. Normal people who didn't play twisted games in the woods. We burst out of the tree line into the small parking area after what felt like hours, but was probably 20 minutes of pure adrenaline-fueled running, and there was the Ford Ranger sitting exactly where we'd left it, looking like the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen in my life. Jason was fumbling for his keys before we even reached it, his hands trembling so bad he dropped them twice in the gravel. But when we got within 10 feet of the truck, we both stopped dead because the ground around it was covered in footprints, dozens and dozens of boot prints in the soft dirt circling the vehicle over and over again, like someone had been walking rounds while we were gone. The prints went around at least 7 or 8 times, maybe more, and in some places you could see where whoever it was had stopped and stood still, the impressions deeper there like they'd been waiting, watching the trail to see when we'd come back. Jason made this sound, not quite a sob but close, and practically dove for the driver's side door, jamming the key in the lock so hard I thought he might break it. The doors weren't damaged, The windows were intact. Nothing seemed touched except for those prints and one other thing. Tucked under the windshield wiper was another paper mask. This one with hollow black circles for eyes and no mouth at all. Just smooth white paper where a mouth should be. And written across the forehead in that same black marker were the words, "You didn't finish the game." Jason ripped the mask off the windshield and threw it on the ground. Then we both jumped in the truck and locked the doors so fast the sound echoed off the trees. He turned the key and for one horrible second the engine just clicked. That dead battery sound that makes your soul leave your body. But then it roared to life on the second try and we were moving, gravel spraying everywhere as Jason reversed too fast and nearly hit a tree. As we spun around to face the exit, all three figures emerged from the forest edge at different points, standing in that same unnatural stillness, watching us leave. One of them raised their hand, not in a wave but holding it up like they were showing us something, and even from inside the truck I could see it was another folded piece of paper. Jason floored it down the forestry road, taking the turns way too fast. The truck fishtailing on the loose gravel while I kept looking back expecting to see vehicles following us. But there was nothing, just empty road and dust. We didn't stop or slow down until we hit the main highway 40 minutes later, and even then Jason kept checking the mirrors obsessively, while I called 911 on my finally working phone. The sheriff's deputy who met us at a gas station in the nearest town looked exactly like every small-town cop you've ever seen, thick mustache and skeptical expression included. And I could tell within the first minute of our story that he thought we were full of shit. He took notes about the masks and the people in camouflage, said he'd have someone check the trail, but kept asking if we'd been drinking or taking anything, looking at our pupils with his flashlight, even though it was barely afternoon. When Jason demanded they go up there right now, that those people might still be there, the deputy said something about bow season bringing out all kinds of hunters and how city kids often misinterpret normal forest activity. He gave us his card, said to call if anything else happened, and suggested we head home and get some rest. The drive back to campus took forever, neither of us talking much, just listening to the engine and watching every car that got too close. And when we finally made it to our apartment, Jason went straight to his room and didn't come out for the rest of the weekend. The next Thursday, Jason finally told me he'd been doing research online, finding old news articles about hikers going missing in that area over the years, though nothing recent enough to seem connected to what we'd experienced. He showed me this blog post from 3 years earlier, where someone described finding paper masks on trees during a solo hike. But the post ended abruptly, and the account never updated again. We decided to never talk about it with anyone else after our friends started making jokes about us getting spooked by hunters, calling us paranoid whenever we declined invitations to go camping. But here's the thing that still makes me lock my doors twice every night and avoid hiking altogether. About a month after that trip, right before winter break, I was walking to my car in the campus parking garage when I found something tucked under my wiper. It was a piece of notebook paper, folded exactly like the ones in the forest, and written in that same black marker was a single line: "Games don't end just because you stop playing." I moved apartments the next week, changed my phone number, even transferred to a different school the following semester, telling everyone it was for a better program. That was 4 years ago, and I live in a different state now. Work in an office where the biggest threat is paper cuts and bad coffee. But sometimes I still get this feeling like someone's been in my apartment while I was at work. Nothing stolen or moved. Just this sense that someone stood in my space, breathing my air, waiting. Jason and I don't talk anymore. He dropped out that spring. Last I heard, he was living with his parents and working construction. But about 6 months ago, I got an email from an address I didn't recognize with no subject line and just an attachment. When I opened it against my better judgment, it was a photo of a tree with a paper mask pinned to it, those same hollow eyes and missing mouth, and in the background, blurry but unmistakable, was the apartment building I'd just moved into 3 weeks earlier. I went to the police, but what could I say that didn't sound insane? And what crime had actually been committed anyway? So now I just live with it, changing locks that probably don't matter, avoiding forests I used to love, and wondering if one day I'll come home to find footprints circling my car again, or worse, finally meet whoever's been playing this game for so much longer than just that one November morning. The mountains of Colorado had been calling me for years, ever since I'd moved there after college. That morning in early February, I woke up in my small apartment in Boulder, checking the weather reports one more time before heading out. A storm system was moving in from the west, but the forecasters said it wouldn't hit until late evening. Plenty of time for me to summit Gray's Peak and get back down. My brother Kevin had texted me the night before, worried about me going solo again, but I'd done this route at least a dozen times in various conditions. The trick with winter mountaineering isn't just knowing the mountain, it's respecting it enough to turn back when things go south. What I didn't know that morning, sipping my black coffee and checking my gear one final time, was that the weather models had gotten it wrong by about 6 hours. My 29th birthday had been just last week, and Kevin kept joking I should start acting more responsible. But the mountains were where I felt most alive. I reached the trailhead around 7 in the morning, the parking area completely empty except for my pickup truck. The temperature gauge on my dashboard read -12 degrees Fahrenheit, but with my layers, merino wool base, insulated middle, and my trusted red shell jacket, I felt prepared. My pack contained all the essentials: extra batteries for my GPS, energy bars, 2 liters of water in insulated bottles, emergency bivvy, headlamp, and my avalanche beacon. I'd even thrown in chemical hand warmers as backup. The first 2 miles went smoothly, my crampons biting into the packed snow as I followed the summer trail route. The sky above showed that deceptive winter blue that makes you think everything's going to be fine, but I noticed the wind picking up earlier than expected, sending small snow devils spinning across the exposed sections of trail. Around 9:30, I reached the tree line where the real climb begins. The temperature had dropped even further, and ice crystals formed on my beard every time I exhaled. My GPS showed I was making good time, about 3 miles in with another 4 to the summit. The device had been acting sluggish in the cold, taking longer to refresh my position, but I didn't think much of it. I'd memorized this route anyway, knew every switchback and false summit. The ridge ahead looked pristine, untouched snow gleaming like crushed diamonds in the morning sun. I stopped to eat an energy bar and drink some water, making sure to keep the bottles inside my jacket between sips so they wouldn't freeze. That's when I noticed the clouds building on the western horizon, dark and heavy, moving faster than they should have been. The weather apps on my phone still showed the storm arriving around 8 that evening, but those clouds told a different story. By the time I reached the final approach to the summit ridge, around 11, the sky had transformed completely. What had been crystal blue was now a threatening gray, and the wind had gone from annoying to genuinely concerning, gusting hard enough to knock me sideways if I wasn't careful. My GPS screen flickered once, twice, then went completely black. The cold had killed it, despite the extra batteries warming in my chest pocket. I pulled out my phone to use as backup navigation, but the battery indicator showed only 15%. The cold was draining it faster than I'd ever seen. I managed to send one quick message to Kevin, almost at the summit. The message showed delivered just before the screen went dark. No GPS, no phone, and those clouds were moving in like a wall of static on an old television, eating up the valley below me. I could maybe make the summit in 30 minutes, but getting down would take at least 3 hours in good conditions, and these weren't going to be good conditions much longer. The smart move would have been to turn around right then, use the remaining visibility to get below tree line before the storm hit. But I kept thinking about that message to Kevin, almost at the summit, and how close I actually was. Pride is a dangerous thing on a mountain. I decided to push for the summit, telling myself I'd just tag it quickly and head straight back down. The wind was howling now, probably 40 miles per hour with stronger gusts, and the first snowflakes started hitting my goggles like tiny needles. Within 10 minutes, those few flakes had become a complete whiteout. I couldn't see more than 15 feet in any direction, and the wind-driven snow had already started filling in my tracks from the way up. The summit cairn appeared suddenly out of the white void, just a pile of frozen rocks that meant nothing now except that I'd made it. No celebration, no photos, just the immediate realization that I'd made a potentially fatal mistake. The descent started bad and got worse fast. Without GPS, I had to rely on terrain features to navigate. But in a whiteout, every snow-covered rock looks the same. I knew I needed to follow the ridge northeast for about a quarter mile before turning down the eastern face. But after 5 minutes of walking, I had no idea if I'd gone 50 feet or 500. The wind was so loud I couldn't even hear my own breathing, just this constant roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. My goggles kept fogging and freezing over, forcing me to clear them every few steps. That's when I noticed my fingers weren't working quite right. The early stages of frostbite setting in despite my insulated gloves. I'd been out in the cold too long, moving too slowly, and my body was starting to shut down the extremities to preserve core heat. Every mountaineer knows that once frostbite starts, you're on borrowed time. I made the decision to stop moving and dig in. The alternative was wandering blind off a cliff or into an avalanche zone. Using my ice axe and what strength I had left, I carved out a small depression in the lee side of what felt like a large boulder, though I couldn't actually see it properly through the storm. The emergency bivy sack from my pack took 3 tries to open with my fumbling fingers, and getting inside it while wearing crampons in that wind was like trying to fold myself into an envelope during a hurricane. Once inside, I pulled out the chemical hand warmers I'd packed, cracking them and shoving them into my gloves and boots. The relief was immediate, but I knew it was temporary. These would only last a few hours. My watch showed it was just past noon. If the storm followed the original forecast and cleared by evening, I might have a chance. If it lasted through the night, the math became much simpler and much worse. The survival statistics for overnight exposure at 14,000 feet in a blizzard aren't something you want to think about when you're living them. Inside the bivy sack, with the wind screaming just inches from my face, I had time to really consider my situation. Search and rescue wouldn't even start looking until tomorrow at the earliest. Kevin would assume I was hunkered down somewhere safe for the night when I didn't check in. The mountain rescue teams don't deploy in conditions like these anyway. It would just add more casualties. My choices had narrowed to 2 equally terrible options: stay put and hope I could survive 18 to 20 hours in sub-zero temperatures with minimal shelter, or try to descend blind through terrain that killed experienced climbers even in good weather. The eastern face had several cliff bands that required careful route finding and perfect visibility. One wrong turn and I'd walk straight off a 100-foot drop. But staying put meant fighting hypothermia all night, with just a thin bivy sack between me and the kind of cold that stops hearts. I could already feel it creeping in. That drowsy warmth that isn't warmth at all, but your body lying to you as it shuts down. Then I remembered something from an avalanche course I'd taken years ago, the instructor talking about terrain navigation in whiteouts. He'd mentioned following fall lines, how water and gravity never lie about which way is down. If I could find the natural drainage of the slope and follow it carefully, testing each step with my ice axe, I might be able to descend without walking off a cliff. It was still insanely risky, but it gave me something better than blind wandering. I forced myself out of the bivy sack, the wind immediately trying to rip it from my numb hands as I stuffed it back in my pack. The hand warmers had helped enough that I could grip my ice axe properly, though I couldn't feel my toes anymore. I started probing the snow ahead of me, feeling for the subtle dip that would indicate the natural fall line of the slope. Each step became a ritual. Probe with the axe, test the snow stability, shift my weight forward, repeat. Time lost all meaning in that white void. I could have been moving for 20 minutes or 2 hours. The first cliff band announced itself when my ice axe suddenly found nothing but air. I'd been shuffling forward in my careful rhythm when the axe just dropped, nearly pulling me forward with it. I jerked back, heart hammering, and sat down hard in the snow. In clear weather, I knew there was a way around this cliff to the north, maybe 200 yards along the ridge, but 200 yards in a whiteout might as well be 200 miles. I started traversing left, keeping the drop on my right, using it as my only reference point in the featureless white. That's when I heard it, or thought I heard it through the wind. A sound like thunder, but wrong somehow, coming from above me. My brain took a second to process what that sound meant at 14,000 feet in a blizzard. Avalanche. Somewhere upslope, tons of snow had cut loose and were heading down. In a whiteout, I couldn't see where it was coming from or which way to run. Training kicked in before conscious thought. I drove my ice axe deep into the snow and wrapped the leash around my wrist, then dropped flat and dug my crampons in, making myself as small and anchored as possible. The rumbling grew louder, the ground vibrating beneath me, and then the air pressure changed, that distinctive whoosh of displaced air that comes right before impact. The avalanche hit me from the left side, not the massive wall of snow I'd feared, but the edge of the slide, powder blast and chunks of ice that slammed into me like a frozen waterfall. For maybe 10 seconds I couldn't breathe, couldn't see, couldn't do anything but hold on to that axe while the mountain tried to tear me loose. When it passed, I was buried up to my waist, but still anchored, still alive. My pack had been partially torn off, hanging by one strap, and my goggles were completely gone. The avalanche had actually done me one favor. It had scoured away the loose snow on the slope, revealing older, harder-packed snow beneath that showed the actual shape of the terrain. Through the still driving snow, I could make out darker shapes that had to be rock outcroppings, giving me reference points for the first time in hours. The rest of the descent became a blur of controlled terror and small victories. Using those exposed rocks as guides, I managed to navigate around 2 more cliff bands, though the second one required a horrible traverse across a 45-degree slope that creaked ominously under my weight. My feet had gone from numb to burning, paradoxically a good sign that blood flow was returning, though I knew I'd lose at least a few toes to frostbite. Around 3 in the afternoon, according to my watch, I literally stumbled into the tree line. The sudden appearance of a gnarled pine tree making me cry with relief inside my frozen face mask. The trees meant I was below 12,000 feet, out of the death zone, though still far from safe. The storm continued for another 4 hours as I picked my way down through the forest, following the drainage that I knew eventually led to the trail. By the time I reached my truck, it was dark, my headlamp barely penetrating the still falling snow. The engine took 3 tries to start, and I had to scrape ice from the inside of the windshield before I could drive. My fingers were too damaged to work my phone, so I drove straight to the emergency room in Georgetown, stumbling through the doors looking like something from a horror movie. Ice-covered, bloodshot eyes, and unable to speak clearly through my swollen, frostbitten lips. The final tally from that day. I lost 3 toes on my left foot and 2 on my right to frostbite, along with the tip of my ring finger. The doctor said I was lucky. Another hour out there, and I would have lost both feet entirely, if not my life. Kevin drove down from Denver that night, and I'll never forget the look on his face when he walked into that hospital room, this mixture of relief and fury that only a sibling can manage. He didn't say, "I told you so," but he didn't have to. The storm ended up lasting 36 hours, dumping 4 feet of snow, and claiming the lives of 2 other climbers on different peaks that same day. The search and rescue coordinator who visited me later said they wouldn't have even started looking for me until day 3, and by then they would have been looking for a body. What haunts me most isn't the pain or the permanent damage to my feet that ended my serious climbing days. It's the knowledge that every single decision I made that day was wrong, that my experience and confidence had become arrogance, and that the mountain had given me a lesson I barely survived learning. I still live in Colorado, still look at those peaks every morning from my apartment window, but I don't climb anymore. Not like before. Sometimes I take easy summer hikes on well-marked trails, always with a group, always turning back at the first sign of weather. People ask if I miss it, the real mountaineering, the challenge of winter ascents. The truth is, I do miss it every single day, but I also remember the taste of my own mortality in that blizzard, the way my body betrayed me in the cold, and the terrible randomness of surviving when others didn't. The mountains are still beautiful, still calling, but now I know what that call really is, not an invitation, but a warning. My frostbite scars ache when the temperature drops, a permanent reminder written in damaged nerve endings and missing flesh. Some lessons you carry in your mind, others you carry in your body. This one, I carry in both. Every parent thinks they're prepared for the worst until it actually happens. And that Saturday in early June changed everything about how I see the wilderness. My accounting firm in Eugene had given me a long weekend off, and I'd been taking groups into the Oregon backcountry since my college days as a wilderness guide, which meant I knew these trails better than most people know their own neighborhoods. My son Nathan had just turned 14 that spring, and he'd been begging me to take him and his buddies on a real backpacking trip, not just the day hikes we usually did around town. The boys had finished 8th grade the week before, and this was supposed to be their celebration before high school started in the fall. Nathan's friends, Bradley and Josh, were good kids I'd known since they were in elementary school together. Both from families who trusted me enough to sign the permission slips without asking too many questions about the overnight camping part. We'd chosen a section of trail in the Cascade Range that I knew inside out, a moderate 15-mile loop that would challenge the boys without putting them in any real danger. Bradley was the joker of the group, constantly making the other two laugh with impressions of their teachers and ridiculous commentary about everything we passed on the trail, while Josh was quieter, more observant, always pointing out interesting plants or rock formations and asking me questions about the ecosystem. Nathan fell somewhere in between his friends, trying to act mature and responsible since his dad was there, but still breaking into giggles whenever Bradley did something particularly absurd. The weather forecast had been perfect, clear skies and temperatures in the low 70s, and we'd made good time that morning, covering about 6 miles before stopping for lunch near a creek crossing around noon. The boys were in high spirits talking about their plans for summer, the girls they had crushes on, and arguing about which video game they'd play first when they got home Sunday night. The creek where we stopped was running higher than usual from the late spring snowmelt, crystal clear water rushing over smooth granite rocks that had been polished by centuries of flow. Josh had finished his sandwich first and was already crouched by the water's edge, filling his bottle, while Bradley tried to balance on a fallen log that stretched halfway across the stream. Nathan was helping me collect the trash from lunch, stuffing granola bar wrappers into the designated garbage bag we'd pack out, when Bradley announced he needed to refill his water bottle too. All 3 boys had those fancy filtered bottles their parents had bought specifically for this trip, the kind that could supposedly clean any water source, though I'd still insisted we stick to running streams just to be safe. The sound of the creek was loud enough that we had to raise our voices slightly to talk, which is probably why none of us noticed exactly when Josh stood up from the water's edge and walked back toward the trees. Bradley was still messing around on his log, pretending to be a tightrope walker and making Nathan laugh, when I did a quick head count and came up 1 short. The space where Josh had been crouching by the creek was empty, just his water bottle cap sitting on a rock where he'd left it. My first thought was that he'd gone behind a tree to take a leak, which was perfectly normal, so I called out his name in that casual way parents do when they're not really worried yet. No answer came back, just the constant rush of water over rocks and Bradley asking what was wrong. Nathan immediately picked up on the change in my voice and started scanning the tree line, while Bradley hopped off his log and jogged over to where Josh had been. The forest around us was thick with Douglas firs and hemlocks, their trunks creating a maze of shadows even in the midday sun, but visibility was still decent for about 30 yards in most directions. The next 10 minutes shifted from mild concern to genuine worry as we spread out in different directions, calling Josh's name with increasing volume and urgency. Bradley found the first tracks about 20 feet from where Josh had been filling his water bottle, clear boot prints in the soft dirt heading back toward the main trail we'd come from. The prints were definitely Josh's, matching the distinctive waffle pattern of his new hiking boots that his mom had bought him specifically for this trip. We followed them together, the 3 of us moving quickly but carefully, expecting to find Josh around every bend, maybe sitting on a rock checking his phone or taking pictures of something interesting he'd spotted. But the tracks kept going, weaving between trees in an oddly purposeful way, like he'd been following something or someone, though we hadn't seen another soul on the trail all morning. About 200 yards from the creek, right where the trail curved around a massive boulder covered in moss, the footprints simply stopped, as if Josh had been lifted straight up into the air. Nathan was the first to start genuinely panicking, his voice cracking as he called out for Josh over and over, while Bradley kept insisting this had to be some elaborate prank, that Josh was probably hiding behind a tree waiting to jump out and scare us. But I knew Josh wasn't that kind of kid, never had been in all the years I'd known him, and the way those tracks just ended made every hair on my arm stand straight up. I pulled out my phone to check for signal, knowing it was unlikely but hoping maybe I could call for help. But the screen showed exactly what I expected. No service, not even a single bar. The GPS on my phone was acting strange too, showing our location jumping around erratically, placing us sometimes miles away from where we actually stood. My old compass, the one my father had given me 20 years ago when I first started hiking, was spinning lazily in circles when I pulled it from my pack, the needle refusing to settle on magnetic north or any direction at all. The afternoon sun was already starting to angle through the trees when I made the decision to search in a grid pattern, keeping Nathan and Bradley within sight at all times while we methodically covered the area around where the tracks disappeared. Every few minutes I'd blow the emergency whistle attached to my pack, 3 short bursts followed by 3 long ones. The universal distress signal I'd taught all 3 boys at the start of our hike. Bradley had gone quiet, no more jokes or attempts to lighten the mood, just mechanically calling Josh's name every 30 seconds, like some kind of broken recording. Nathan stayed close to me, close enough that I could hear his breathing getting more ragged with each passing minute, and I kept putting my hand on his shoulder to reassure him, even though I felt anything but reassured myself. We must have covered every square foot of forest within a quarter-mile radius, checking behind fallen logs, inside the hollow base of an old-growth cedar, even looking up into the canopy in case Josh had somehow decided to climb a tree, though that made no logical sense whatsoever. Around 4 in the afternoon, just as I was preparing to make the difficult decision to hike back to the trailhead and get professional help, we heard it. 3 short whistles followed by 3 long ones, exactly the pattern I demonstrated that morning, coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. Nathan grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks, his eyes wide with hope and terror mixed together, while Bradley started shouting Josh's name so loudly that his voice cracked and went hoarse. The whistles came again, maybe 300 yards away, though the acoustic properties of the forest made it impossible to pinpoint the exact direction. We crashed through the underbrush toward the sound, no longer worried about staying on the trail or keeping quiet, branches scratching our arms and faces as we pushed through sections of thick salal and rhododendron. But every time we thought we were getting closer, the whistles would come from a different direction, sometimes behind us, sometimes to our left or right, always maintaining that same perfect pattern I'd taught them. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. Darkness came faster than it should have in early June, or maybe it just felt that way because we were deep under the canopy, chasing those whistles like they were pulling us on invisible strings. I finally had to make the call to stop pursuing the sounds and focus on our own safety, even though it felt like abandoning Josh, like giving up on him when he might be just beyond the next cluster of trees. Nathan was stumbling with exhaustion, and Bradley had gone completely silent except for occasional whimpers he probably didn't even realize he was making. I set up our emergency shelter in a small clearing, just a basic tarp configuration that would keep the dew off us, though none of us had any intention of actually sleeping. The temperature dropped faster than the forecast had predicted, going from comfortable to requiring our fleece jackets in less than an hour, and I distributed the extra food I'd packed, though nobody had any appetite. Throughout it all, those whistles continued, sometimes distant like they were miles away, other times so close it seemed like Josh should be standing right next to us. But we never saw anything, not even a shadow moving between the trees. The longest night of my life was measured in those whistles, which came exactly every 17 minutes according to my watch, never varying by more than a few seconds. Always that same mechanical precision that made my chest tight with dread. Bradley finally broke around midnight, sobbing into his hands about how Josh's parents were going to hate him forever, how this was all his fault for suggesting this stupid trip in the first place, while Nathan sat pressed against my side, trembling but trying to be brave in that heartbreaking way kids do, when they're terrified but don't want to show it. I kept the flashlight beam sweeping back and forth across the clearing, telling myself I was looking for Josh, but really just needing to see that nothing was approaching us from the darkness. Sometime around 3 in the morning, the whistle stopped mid-pattern, cutting off after just 2 short blasts, and the silence that followed was somehow worse than the sounds had been, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. First light came as a relief so intense I actually felt my muscles unclench for the first time in hours, and I immediately started breaking down our makeshift camp while the boys sat huddled together, neither of them speaking or meeting my eyes. The hike back to the trailhead took less than 2 hours, though it felt like days, with both boys practically jogging despite their exhaustion, desperate to get back to civilization and away from those woods. My truck was still the only vehicle in the small gravel parking area, covered in pine needles and morning dew, like it had been there for weeks instead of just one night. I drove straight to the ranger station in town, not even stopping when Bradley threw up out the window halfway there, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. The Rangers mobilized faster than I expected, calling in a search and rescue team from the county, dogs, even a helicopter that would arrive within the hour, and they separated us for individual statements while one ranger stayed with the boys and gave them hot chocolate and blankets even though it wasn't cold anymore. The lead ranger, a woman named Teresa who'd probably seen more lost hikers than she could count, pulled me aside after the search teams had deployed and showed me something on her computer that made my whole body go numb. The trail register data showed no other hiking permits had been issued for that section of forest in the past 4 days, and the motion-activated wildlife cameras they had stationed along the main trail confirmed it. Nobody else had entered or exited that area except our group. They found Josh 8 hours later, sitting calmly on a log about 50 feet from where we'd eaten lunch, his water bottle full, his clothes clean, with no memory of anything past kneeling by the creek to fill up his bottle. The medical evaluation found nothing wrong with him physically or mentally, just a blank gap where the last 20 hours should have been, and when they asked him about the whistles, he looked confused and said he didn't know the emergency signal because he'd been tying his bootlace when I'd demonstrated it that morning, which his parents confirmed was exactly the kind of thing Josh would do, always distracted at crucial moments. The investigation went on for another 2 weeks, with rangers and even some federal forestry officials combing through every inch of that trail, but they never found any explanation for what happened that day. Josh's parents were just grateful to have him back safe, though they politely declined when I offered to pay for therapy sessions, saying they'd handle it as a family, and I understood the unspoken message that they blamed me, even if they were too kind to say it out loud. Bradley and Nathan never talked about that night, not to each other, not to their parents, not even to me, though Nathan started sleeping with his light on and quit the wilderness club at school the following fall. The official report listed it as a case of temporary disorientation, possibly caused by dehydration or mild heat exhaustion, completely ignoring the 20 hours Josh was missing, the malfunctioning compass and GPS, and those perfectly timed whistles that none of us could explain. I sold all my camping gear at a yard sale that July, told people I was just too busy with work to keep up with hiking. But the truth is I can't even drive past a forest without remembering those sounds echoing through the trees, always exactly 17 minutes apart, always in that pattern Josh swore he never learned. 6 months later, I ran into Josh's mother at the grocery store, and she pulled me aside near the frozen food section, her voice barely above a whisper as she told me something that made my knees nearly buckle right there next to the ice cream freezers. Josh had started whistling in his sleep about a month after the incident, the exact same pattern we'd heard in the woods, and when she tried to wake him during these episodes, he'd sit up with his eyes wide open but completely unfocused, continuing to whistle for exactly 17 minutes before lying back down with no memory of it in the morning. She'd taken him to specialists in Portland, even a neurologist at the university hospital. But every test came back normal, no sign of trauma or abnormality in his brain. Just a 13-year-old kid who sometimes whistled a distress signal he insisted he'd never learned. They moved to California that winter, something about a job opportunity for Josh's father. But I knew the real reason. The same reason I'd started looking at accounting jobs in other states, far from any mountains or forests. The last thing she said to me before hurrying away with her cart was that Josh had stopped the whistling after they'd crossed the state line. Just stopped completely, like whatever had been causing it couldn't follow them that far. And I wanted to feel relieved for them, but all I could think about was Nathan, still living 3 blocks away from me, and whether distance really mattered to whatever we'd encountered out there in those woods. Six months ago, my husband Christopher and I decided to explore some back roads in northern Michigan during what should have been a simple weekend camping trip. At 32, I worked remotely doing medical transcription, and Chris taught high school chemistry, so we often took advantage of long weekends to disconnect from everything and just drive through the forests. We'd been married for 4 years by then, and these little adventures were our way of keeping things interesting, discovering hidden waterfalls or abandoned mining towns that weren't in any guidebook. That particular Saturday in early April started like any other exploration day. Coffee in thermoses, trail mix in the console, and Chris's ancient Jeep Cherokee loaded with camping gear, just in case we decided to stay somewhere overnight. The morning had been foggy, but by noon the sun was breaking through the trees, creating those beautiful light shafts that photographers always chase, and we were both in great moods, singing along to the classic rock station until the signal faded into static. About 3 hours into our drive, somewhere between Grayling and Roscommon, we turned onto a Forest Service road that looked promising. You know how some roads just call to you, especially when they curve away into dense pine forests, where the canopy gets so thick it blocks out the sky. The gravel crunched under our tires as we drove deeper, passing the occasional hunting blind, and a few rusted mailboxes marking driveways that disappeared into the woods, probably leading to old cabins or trailers where people went to disappear from the world. Chris kept checking his phone for GPS signal, but we'd lost all bars about 20 minutes earlier, which honestly made it more exciting because we had no idea where this road would lead us, just following its twists and turns through increasingly wild terrain. Then we saw the sign, bright yellow with black lettering, impossible to miss even though someone had shot it up with buckshot at some point, leaving little holes that let sunlight through like stars. Trail closed. Authorized personnel only. Violators will be prosecuted. The road beyond it looked recently graded though, fresh tire tracks in the dirt, and Chris slowed the Jeep to a stop, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel the way he always did when he was thinking about doing something we probably shouldn't do. I remember the exact song that was playing through the static, Hotel California, and how Chris turned to me with that boyish grin that still made my heart skip even after all these years together, asking if I wanted to see what was so special that they needed to close the trail. The thing about Chris is that he could make anything sound reasonable, and besides, the tracks meant someone had been through recently, so how dangerous could it really be if maintenance crews or whoever were still using the road regularly? We drove past the sign slowly, both of us scanning the trees like we expected a ranger to jump out and give us a ticket. But there was nothing except more forest, and that freshly maintained road curving ahead through towering white pines that must have been there since before Michigan was even a state. After maybe 10 minutes of this increasingly narrow road, just when I was about to suggest we turn back because the trees were starting to press in so close that branches scraped the sides of the Jeep, we came around a sharp bend and saw it. A small wooden structure, maybe 12 by 15 feet, with a green metal roof and a single window glowing with warm yellow light, even though it was barely mid-afternoon. A white pickup truck, one of those government-looking ones with a light bar on top but no actual agency markings, was parked right outside, and the whole scene looked so normal, so mundane, that we both relaxed immediately, figuring we'd just stumbled onto some kind of forestry service outpost where they probably stored equipment, or did paperwork or whatever Forest Service people do in their little shacks in the middle of nowhere. Chris parked behind the truck and we sat there for a moment, debating whether to knock and maybe ask for directions back to the main road since we'd been wandering for hours, or just turn around and leave before anyone noticed we'd ignored the closed trail sign. But curiosity won, the way it always did with us, and Chris said we should at least say hello, maybe apologize for being on the closed road and see if they had a map or something, because the person who owned that truck was probably inside doing paperwork or eating lunch or whatever. We got out and immediately noticed how quiet everything was. Not normal forest quiet, where you still hear birds and squirrels and wind through branches, but that complete absence of sound that makes your ears ring, like the whole forest was holding its breath. The door to the shack was one of those heavy wooden ones with iron hardware, painted Forest Service green but peeling in places to show weathered wood underneath. And Chris knocked 3 times, firm but friendly, calling out, "Hello? Sorry to bother you?" in that disarming teacher voice he used when trying to calm down agitated parents at school conferences. Nobody answered, but we could hear something inside. A low electrical hum like a generator or maybe a space heater, and underneath that, a rhythmic creaking sound, like someone rocking in an old chair, or maybe just the building settling in the wind, except there wasn't any wind that day. Chris knocked again, louder this time, and when still nobody came to the door, he tried the handle, locked, which wasn't surprising. But then he noticed the window beside the door had its curtain partially pulled back, leaving a gap maybe 6 inches wide where warm light spilled out onto the wooden deck. He glanced at me with raised eyebrows, that universal spouse language for "should I?" And before I could really answer either way, he was already stepping over to peer through that gap, cupping his hands around his eyes to cut the glare from the afternoon sun. I watched his body language change in real time. First casual curiosity as he leaned forward, then a sudden stiffening of his shoulders, and finally this violent jerk backward, like someone had yanked him away from the window by his collar, his face going from its normal healthy pink to this awful gray color I'd only seen once before, when he'd gotten food poisoning from bad seafood on our honeymoon. "We need to leave," he said, and his voice came out all wrong, high and tight like someone was strangling him, and he grabbed my wrist hard enough to hurt, already pulling me toward the Jeep before I could even process what was happening. I tried to ask what he'd seen, but he just kept repeating, now, we need to leave now," under his breath like a prayer or a mantra, fumbling with the keys so badly he dropped them twice before managing to get the door open. His panic was contagious. I found myself running to the passenger side without understanding why, my heart hammering against my ribs as I jumped in and slammed the door, watching Chris jam the key into the ignition with trembling fingers. The Jeep roared to life and he threw it in reverse so fast the tires spun, spraying gravel against the underside. And I remember gripping the door handle so hard my knuckles went white as he executed the fastest 3-point turn I'd ever seen him do, the whole vehicle lurching and fishtailing as he got us turned around on that narrow road. We must have driven for 20 minutes in complete silence, except for the roar of the engine and the gravel pinging off the chassis. Chris taking those forest curves way too fast, branches slapping against the windshield and leaving streaks of pine sap, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles jumping under his skin. When we finally burst past that shot-up closure sign and onto the main forest road, he pulled over immediately, killed the engine and just sat there breathing like he'd run a marathon, his white-knuckled hands still gripping the steering wheel even though we'd stopped moving. I touched his shoulder gently and he actually flinched. Chris, who'd never flinched at anything in all the years I'd known him, who'd pulled a neighbor's dog out of a frozen pond without hesitation, who'd faced down aggressive parents at school meetings without blinking. "Chris, honey, what did you see in there?" I asked, keeping my voice soft and calm even though every cell in my body was screaming with the need to know what could have possibly triggered this kind of reaction in my steady, unshakable husband. He turned to look at me then, and I'll never forget the expression on his face. Not just fear, but this deep, visceral revulsion mixed with something else. Something I couldn't quite identify until much later when I realized it was shame. Like he'd seen something so horrible that just witnessing it had somehow contaminated him. There were restraints, he finally whispered, and the word came out broken, like it hurt him physically to say it. Metal restraints bolted into the floor, 4 sets of them arranged in a circle around this drain, like... He stopped, swallowing hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. And the walls. There was blood on the walls, not old and brown but fresh, still wet in some places. And these tools hanging on pegboard, medical looking but wrong somehow, modified. And there was a camera on a tripod pointed at the restraints, one of those expensive digital ones with the red recording light still blinking. His words came faster and faster, like he needed to get them out before he lost the courage, before his mind could fully process what he was saying. And in the corner, there were trash bags, black contractor bags, at least 6 of them tied off and stacked, and one was leaking something dark onto the floor, and the smell coming through the window crack. God, like copper pennies and raw meat and something chemical, like bleach but sweeter. The worst part wasn't even what he described. It was what happened next, when we heard an engine in the distance growing louder, coming from deeper in the forest along the same closed trail we'd just fled from. Chris went rigid beside me, his breath catching in his throat, and without a word he started the Jeep again, pulling back onto the road with deliberate, controlled movements, nothing like the panicked flight from before, trying to look like 2 normal people on a normal drive who definitely hadn't just been somewhere they shouldn't have been. We passed a dark blue van about 2 miles down the road, heading in the opposite direction toward that shack, and I caught a glimpse of the driver, a completely ordinary-looking middle-aged man with glasses and a baseball cap, the kind of person you'd see at any grocery store or gas station and never think twice about. Chris kept his eyes straight ahead, but I saw his hands tighten on the wheel as the van passed, and in my side mirror, I watched its brake lights flare red as it slowed, maybe just navigating the rough road, or maybe the driver was watching us too, memorizing our license plate, wondering if we were the reason the door to his shack would be standing slightly ajar when he arrived, the gravel disturbed where we'd parked. We drove straight home, 4 hours without stopping, not even for gas until we were at least 100 miles away from those woods. And when we finally pulled into our driveway in Sterling Heights, Chris went directly to his laptop and spent hours looking at missing persons reports from northern Michigan, his face getting paler with each article he read. He found 3 cases from the last 18 months, hikers who'd vanished without a trace from trails in that general area, their cars found at trailheads, no signs of struggle, just gone like they'd walked into the forest and dissolved into mist. But what really destroyed him, what made him close the laptop and walk to the bathroom where I heard him throwing up, was finding a news article from 2 weeks before our trip about a family of 4 whose RV had been found abandoned on a Forest Service road, their golden retriever still locked inside, barking himself hoarse, all their belongings untouched including wallets and phones. But the family simply vanished. The article included a photo of them at Christmas, parents in their 30s like us, 2 kids grinning with missing teeth, the kind of normal, happy family you'd see at any school pickup line or weekend soccer game. And Chris just kept staring at their faces until I gently closed the laptop and led him to bed. That was 6 months ago, and Chris still won't talk about it beyond what he told me that day in the Jeep, won't even acknowledge it happened most of the time. But I know he called in an anonymous tip to the state police from a payphone at a rest stop the next day, though nothing ever came of it that we heard about. Sometimes I catch him staring at nothing, and I know he's back there, looking through that window, seeing things that shouldn't exist in a civilized world. And the worst part is that we both know someone is still using that shack, that the man in the blue van went back there and found our tire tracks, maybe found where Chris's handprints disturbed the dust on the window. And somewhere out there is a person who knows that 2 people saw something they shouldn't have seen. We've talked about moving, starting fresh somewhere far from Michigan, but we both know it wouldn't matter. You can't unsee something like that, can't unknow that places like that exist, hidden in plain sight behind closure signs that most people respect, operating in the spaces where nobody thinks to look, where the forest swallows sound and abandoned roads lead to nightmares dressed up as maintenance shacks with their lights still on, waiting for curious couples who should have just kept driving. It happened during a school field trip to a state park somewhere up north. I remember it was early spring because the air was still crisp at night, and the trees hadn't fully grown their leaves yet. Our class had set up camp near a quiet lake, the kind that reflects the moon like a sheet of glass when everything else goes silent. I was 16 at the time, sharing a tent with my two closest friends, Eli and Marcus. The three of us weren't exactly the follow-the-rules type, so when lights out came, sneaking out felt more like a challenge than a bad idea. We waited until the teacher's flashlight stopped sweeping across the campground before unzipping the tent as quietly as we could. The night was darker than we expected. No city glow, no distant traffic, just the dense black of the woods and the faint rustle of wind against the branches. Eli had a cheap flashlight he'd brought from home, the kind that flickered if you tapped it too hard. I remember thinking how ridiculous it was that we were whispering when there was no one around to hear us. Yet something about that silence made us instinctively quieter. The trail started behind the ranger's cabin, a narrow dirt path lined with old wooden signs that were impossible to read in the dark. We followed it anyway, passing by an old fire pit surrounded by half-buried beer cans and broken glass. At first it was exciting, the kind of thrill you get when you know you're breaking the rules but still feel untouchable. But the deeper we went, the less it felt like adventure and more like trespassing into somewhere that didn't want us. About 20 minutes in, Marcus's flashlight caught something ahead, a figure standing right in the middle of the path. At first, we thought it was one of the teachers who had caught us, but the way he stood there didn't make sense. He wasn't moving, not even shifting his weight, just standing, facing our direction, holding something in his right hand that gleamed when the light hit it. It looked like a long knife, maybe a hunting one. None of us said anything for a few seconds. The woods around us were dead quiet, except for the buzzing of insects and the soft hum of Eli's trembling breath. Eli whispered something about turning back, but before any of us could move, the man tilted his head slightly, like he was trying to get a better look at us through the dark. That small movement was enough to send a shock through me. He didn't say a word, didn't step forward, didn't even raise the knife. He just turned his head a bit more, and the reflection from our flashlight hit his face, pale, expressionless, and so still it looked almost painted on. We backed up slowly, trying not to crunch the leaves under our shoes, and when we finally turned around to head back toward camp, we realized the path behind us looked different, like the forest had shifted while we weren't paying attention. We walked faster, whispering to each other about where the trail markers were, trying to find the broken fire pit we'd passed earlier. The trees seemed denser now, their branches leaning over us like arms. Every so often Eli would swing his flashlight back, and the beam would catch glimpses of something, a branch maybe, or just our own shadows. But then Marcus swore he saw movement. He shined his light behind us, and there he was again, standing a few yards away. Same posture, same knife hanging loosely at his side. He wasn't running or hiding. He was just there, watching the glow of our flashlights as if waiting for us to move again. At some point, Eli dropped his flashlight, and when it hit the ground, the light rolled and faced the trees on the left. That's when we saw a second figure, smaller, crouched near the base of a tree. We thought it was an animal at first, until it stood up straight. It was another person. The two of them were perfectly still, both facing us, and in that moment, I couldn't hear anything. No crickets, no wind, not even our own breathing. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath with us. Then, as if they'd agreed on it beforehand, both figures slowly stepped back into the darkness and disappeared. We didn't bother whispering anymore. We just ran. Branches scratched at our faces, roots caught our feet, and the air felt heavier with every step. None of us spoke until we finally saw the dull orange light from the campfire flickering through the trees. We stumbled back into camp, covered in mud, gasping for air, trying to convince ourselves we hadn't really seen what we thought we had. But even after we zipped the tent shut and turned off the flashlights, none of us could sleep. Every time the wind brushed against the tent or something cracked outside, I felt like they were standing there again, just waiting for our light to move. When morning came, it felt unreal, like the forest had swallowed what happened and decided to pretend nothing was wrong. The teachers scolded us for sneaking out, but honestly, I barely heard them. The daylight made everything look harmless. The trail seemed smaller, the trees ordinary. We tried to retrace our steps with the group later that day, but the path we took last night didn't even seem to exist anymore. There was no fire pit, no clearing, no sign of anyone standing there. Eli kept insisting we'd just gotten turned around, but Marcus and I knew exactly where we'd walked. You do not forget something like that. That night I couldn't stop staring at the tree line beyond the tents. Every shadow felt like someone standing there, just outside the reach of the campfire. When the wind picked up, I swore I heard faint footsteps moving through the brush, slow and deliberate, circling the camp. I wanted to wake someone up, but the idea of unzipping the tent again made my chest tighten. I just lay there, staring at the fabric, waiting for the sound to stop. Eventually, exhaustion won, but my sleep was shallow and filled with strange dreams, pale faces between the trees, a blade catching moonlight, and voices whispering my name. The bus ride back home the next morning was quiet. None of us talked about what happened, not even when the teachers asked why we looked like we hadn't slept. It felt like if we said it out loud, we'd make it real again. A few weeks later, Marcus told me his dad had taken him back to the park to hike one weekend. He said the ranger they spoke to mentioned other visitors had reported strange figures on the trails at night, always standing still, never speaking. The ranger brushed it off as pranksters or hunters, but Marcus said the man looked uneasy when he said it, like he knew more than he was willing to admit. I haven't gone camping since. I still think about those two figures, the way they moved in perfect silence, how they only appeared when our flashlights were on them. Sometimes, when I can't sleep, I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't turned around that moment. If we'd kept walking or let our lights go out completely, maybe they would have vanished. Or maybe they would have come closer. Either way, every time I walk near the woods at night and catch a reflection between the trees, I remember that night in the park, and I turn back before the light moves. I live in a small town not far from the national forest, and hiking has always been something that keeps me sane. My boyfriend and I had been exploring different trails every weekend that spring, trying to find quiet places away from the crowds. That morning, we picked a trail we had never tried before, one that led up to a scenic overlook people online described as breathtaking. The drive there was peaceful, miles of green hills, scattered cabins, and a sky that looked heavy with rain but never broke. We parked near a narrow dirt road with a weathered sign barely standing upright, the paint almost gone. It felt like one of those places where nature had started to reclaim what humans had built. The first part of the hike was calm. The air smelled of wet pine, and the sound of a stream followed us for a good while before fading into silence. My boyfriend Aaron walked a few steps ahead, occasionally turning to smile at me as if to say, "See, this was worth it." We talked about getting sandwiches afterward, about maybe bringing friends next time. The quiet there was different, dense but not threatening, almost too still. I remember thinking how rare it felt to be somewhere that untouched, where the only sound was the rhythm of our boots against the dirt. About an hour in, we saw a truck parked slightly off the trail near a clearing. Looked out of place. Older, maybe from the 90s, covered in dried mud. A man stepped out wearing a tan uniform. At first glance, it seemed like a park ranger's outfit, but the color was faded, and the badge on his chest had deep scratches across it, like someone had tried to scrape the emblem off. He waved at us, not with a friendly gesture, but more like he was signaling us to stop. "You two shouldn't go any further," he said, his tone clipped and sharp. "There's been bear activity past the ridge. Aaron thanked him. But I noticed a few things that didn't sit right. The truck had no license plates, not even temporary tags. There were dents along the side as if something had struck it. And the man, he wasn't carrying a radio or any equipment, just a small black backpack slung over one shoulder. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes lingered too long, flicking between the two of us like he was sizing us up. He told us again, more firmly this time, that we needed to turn back immediately. When Aaron asked if the trail was officially closed, the man didn't answer. He just repeated the warning, louder, as if we were children ignoring him. Aaron wanted to keep walking, but something about that man's tone got under my skin. It was not just the words. There was no trace of concern in how he said them. It sounded rehearsed, almost forced, like he was repeating a script. I asked which direction we should take to get back safely, but he only pointed toward the trailhead we had come from. His hand trembled slightly when he did, even though his face stayed completely still. The silence that followed made me feel like we were intruding on something private. Finally, Aaron muttered a quick thanks and turned to leave, and I followed, glancing back once. The man hadn't moved. He stood beside his truck, watching us, his head tilted just a bit too far to one side. We walked in silence for a while after that. The forest felt different now, still the same trees and wind, but heavier somehow, like the air itself had thickened. Every sound made me flinch, branches snapping, birds calling, the crunch of gravel under our boots. After 10 or 15 minutes, Aaron laughed softly and said, maybe the guy was just being overcautious, but he didn't sound convinced. He kept checking behind us, pretending he was just admiring the view. At one point he stopped and said he thought he heard an engine in the distance, but when we listened, there was nothing, just the faint rustle of leaves. When we reached the car, I turned around expecting to see the clearing where the truck had been, but there was nothing there. No tire marks, no broken branches, not even a patch of flattened grass. The spot looked untouched, like no vehicle had ever been parked there. We sat in the car for a moment, trying to laugh it off. Still, Aaron locked the doors before turning the key. The drive down the dirt road felt longer than before. I remember glancing out the window, half expecting to see that same truck behind us. We didn't speak again until we were back on the main road, where the cell signal finally returned. Later that afternoon, we stopped by the ranger station near the park entrance to report what had happened. The woman at the front desk looked confused when I described the man's uniform. She checked a clipboard and then made a call to someone in the back. A few minutes later, another ranger came out, an older man with a serious face, and asked us to repeat everything. When Aaron mentioned the missing license plates, the man's expression changed. He said there were no rangers assigned to that area today, and that part of the trail had been closed last week because a hiker had gone missing near the overlook. The ranger asked us to wait while he made another call. He stepped outside for a moment, and through the window I saw him pacing near a row of vehicles. When he came back, his tone had shifted. He said they had already sent someone to check that trail earlier that morning, another ranger who had found nothing unusual. Then he hesitated before adding that several visitors had mentioned hearing a truck engine in the woods the past few days, though none of them saw the driver. "If you remember anything else," he told us, "please call." He wrote his number on a yellow sticky note and slid it across the counter. I still have it in a drawer somewhere. That night, I could not stop replaying the moment when the man pointed toward the trailhead, the way his hand trembled, the blank look in his eyes. I tried to tell myself he might have been some volunteer or maybe someone pretending to help. But why the scratched badge? Why the missing plates? Aaron said it was better not to think about it, that we were safe, and that was what mattered. Still, I left the light on in the living room that night, half expecting to hear a car idling outside. A few days later, Aaron went back online to read about the missing hiker, a young man in his 20s, last seen heading up the same overlook trail. He never made it back to his car. The article said the only thing search teams found was a torn piece of uniform fabric near a dry creek bed. Not park issue, but close enough to confuse someone from a distance. That detail stayed with me. I stopped hiking for a while after that. Even the idea of walking in the woods made my chest tighten. It has been years since that day, but every time I see a ranger truck on the side of a road, I catch myself slowing down to check the plates. Part of me wants to believe we met someone who meant no harm, maybe just a person who lost his mind out there. But there is another part, quieter and more persistent, that wonders if the man we met was the reason that hiker disappeared, and if turning back when we did was the only thing that kept us from joining him. It started on an unusually quiet weekend when I decided to visit the flea market near the old train depot. I had been saving up for a new lens, but the idea of finding something vintage always tempted me. The air smelled like old wood and metal polish, and every vendor seemed to have a story. That was when I saw it. A black DSLR sitting on a faded red tablecloth, the kind of camera you could tell had seen a lot of miles. The seller, an older man with sunburned skin and a crooked wedding band, said it belonged to a traveler who never came back for it. The price was too good to pass up, so I bought it without asking more. Back home, I wiped the dust off and checked the battery compartment. Inside, tucked beneath the latch, was a small memory card that looked ancient. Out of habit, I slid it into my laptop to see what was on it. Hundreds of photos loaded slowly. A group of 6 hikers smiling in front of a forest trail I instantly recognized. It was only a few miles from my town, a place I'd been to many times to shoot sunrises. The photos looked normal at first, full of laughter and motion blur, until I noticed something strange. In the later ones, a shadowy figure appeared far behind the group, barely visible between the trees. Each frame showed the same figure, blurry, dark, and slightly closer than before. It didn't look like a hiker. Its shape was too long, its posture slightly hunched, and in one shot its head was tilted in a way that didn't seem natural. I zoomed in, but the pixels fell apart before I could make out any features. My chest tightened with a mix of curiosity and unease. Maybe it was a trick of light, or maybe someone was following them. Either way, it made me feel like I was intruding on something private. Should have just deleted the files right then, but curiosity always wins with me. I decided to visit the same trail the next day to recreate the shots for comparison. It was early morning when I packed my camera and left, the fog still low over the fields. The air was colder than I expected, and the forest was dead quiet. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of gravel under my boots. I opened the photos on my phone and started matching the angles one by one, trying to line up the same trees and rocks from the pictures. Everything looked the same, except it felt heavier somehow, like the forest was holding its breath. By the time I reached the spot where the hikers had taken their last photos, the light had started to change. The sun filtered through the branches in thin streaks, painting the moss on the rocks with a pale green glow. I took a few shots, checked my screen, adjusted the focus, and took a few more. Nothing unusual, just trees, a patch of fog, and my tripod standing like a lone figure in the clearing. I stayed a little longer, half expecting to hear footsteps or laughter echoing somewhere beyond the trees, but the forest remained still. It felt like it was waiting for me to leave. When I got back to my car, I sat there for a while, scrolling through the pictures. The forest looked stunning, but I could not shake the thought of that blurred figure. My hands were cold when I turned the key, and the radio buzzed with static before the music kicked in. The drive home was uneventful, though I caught myself glancing at the rearview mirror more often than usual, like something might appear in the back seat if I looked long enough. I told myself I was being ridiculous and laughed it off, though my voice sounded small in the quiet car. That night, I made tea and opened my laptop to compare the old photos with mine. I went through each one slowly, placing them side by side on the screen. Same tree line, same rock formation, same patch of fog in the distance. And then, in the 5th photo, something new appeared. A faint silhouette near the edge of the frame behind the tree line right where I had been standing. I leaned closer, zooming in. It looked like a person, just barely visible, the shape slightly distorted like heat rising off asphalt. I checked another photo, then another. The figure was there again, closer this time, standing behind a cluster of trees. In the next one, it was clearer, not just a shadow or a trick of light. A person, tall and thin, wearing something dark. I pushed away from the desk, trying to convince myself it was someone who had been hiking nearby. But the angle did not make sense. They were always behind me, always at a distance that should have been visible if someone else had been there. Sleep did not come easy that night. Every sound in my apartment felt amplified. The hum of the fridge, the soft creak of the pipes, even the faint buzz from the streetlights outside. I kept telling myself I would check the photos again in the morning, maybe send them to a friend who was good at editing. Still, curiosity got the better of me around midnight. I turned the laptop back on, heart thudding as the screen came to life. I clicked the last image from that day, the one I had taken just before leaving the trail. The figure was there again, unmistakable now, standing a few feet behind me. I sat perfectly still, staring at the image. My reflection in the screen seemed to blend with the dark shape in the photo, like it was watching through me. My mouth felt dry. I opened the next image, one I did not remember taking. It was a shot of my car from a distance, the trunk slightly open. Then another, my apartment building, taken from across the street with my window glowing faintly. My body felt heavy as I realized these photos were not mine. They were newer. The timestamps were from just a few hours earlier. I unplugged the camera and shut my laptop, pacing the room while every shadow seemed to shift. I double-checked the locks on the door, pulled the curtains, and sat in the corner of the room with the lights on. Around 3 in the morning, my phone vibrated with a notification, a message from an unknown number. It contained one image, my living room. Same angle as where I was sitting, same light on, except I was not in the picture. I moved out a week later, sold every camera I owned. I still take pictures for work, but only with my phone now. The police never found anything when I reported it, and I stopped trying to explain the whole thing. After the third time, someone told me it was a prank. Sometimes, though, when I scroll through old folders or cloud backups, a random image will show up that I know I did not take. The same pale outline in the background, always a little closer than before. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. February in the Cascades seemed like a good idea when I planned it from my apartment in Seattle. My sister had just gotten engaged. My job at the insurance company was draining every ounce of energy I had, and turning 34 in a cubicle felt like a slow death. I needed to prove something to myself, I guess, that I could still do hard things, that I was more than spreadsheets and conference calls. The weather forecast showed clear skies for the weekend, and I had hiked Snow Peak Trail twice before during summer months. 6 miles in, 6 miles out. Nothing I could not handle. I packed my gear on Friday night, told my roommate Alicia I would be back Sunday evening, and left before dawn on Saturday morning. The trailhead parking lot was empty when I arrived, which should have been my first warning. But I just thought I was lucky to have the mountain to myself. The first 3 miles were exactly what I needed. Cold air burning my lungs, the crunch of packed snow under my boots, and absolute silence except for the occasional bird. Pine trees lined both sides of the trail like frozen sentinels, their branches heavy with white powder. I stopped around 10 in the morning to eat a granola bar and check my phone. No signal, but I had downloaded the offline trail map. Everything looked perfect. The sky was that impossible shade of winter blue, so bright it almost hurt to look at. I remember thinking this was the clearest my head had felt in months, maybe years. I took a few photos, adjusted my backpack straps, and kept moving. By 11, I noticed the first clouds gathering on the western ridge. They looked far away, nothing urgent. I kept hiking. That was my second mistake, and the one that nearly cost me my life. The storm came faster than anything I had ever experienced. One moment I was walking under scattered clouds, and 40 minutes later, the sky turned the color of wet concrete. The temperature dropped so suddenly that my exposed cheeks went from cold to numb in what felt like seconds. I stopped to pull on my balaclava and extra gloves, fumbling with the zipper on my pack as the first snowflakes started falling. They were not the gentle, floating kind you see in holiday movies. These came down hard and fast, driven sideways by a wind that seemed to appear from nowhere. Within 15 minutes, I could barely see 20 feet ahead. The trail markers, those little orange flags tied to branches that had been guiding me all morning, disappeared into a wall of white. I pulled out my phone to check the offline map, but my fingers were already stiff inside my gloves, and the screen kept registering phantom touches from the moisture. I managed to get my bearings. I was about 4 miles from the trailhead, maybe 4.5. I needed to turn back immediately. Turning back sounds simple when you say it like that, but when visibility drops to almost nothing and every direction looks identical, simple becomes impossible. The trail I had been following was gone, buried under fresh snow that was accumulating faster than I could process. I tried to retrace my footprints, but they were filling in behind me, softening into vague depressions that could have been anything. Rocks, roots, animal tracks. The wind made it hard to think. It was not just cold, it was loud, a constant roaring in my ears that drowned out everything else. I picked a direction that felt right and started walking, telling myself that as long as I kept moving downhill, I would eventually reach the road. That is basic mountain survival. Water flows down, trails follow water, roads follow trails. I just had to stay calm and keep moving. But after 20 minutes of walking, the ground started sloping upward again. I had gone the wrong way. I was heading deeper into the wilderness, not out of it. And that is when I looked down and noticed the footprints. At first, my brain tried to make sense of them in a logical way. I thought maybe I had walked in a circle without realizing it, that these were my own tracks from minutes earlier. But the prints were too fresh, the edges too crisp, and they were not behind me, they were beside me. A second set of boot prints running parallel to mine, maybe 3 feet to my left. I stopped walking and stared at them. The snow was coming down so heavy that any tracks should have been half buried within minutes, but these looked like they had just been made. I turned around slowly, scanning the white void behind me. Nothing. Just snow and trees and that horrible howling wind. I called out, asking if anyone was there, and my voice sounded small and swallowed by the storm. No response. I looked back at the footprints. They were slightly larger than mine. The tread pattern different. Deeper grooves, a blockier heel. Someone else was out here with me. Someone who had been walking right next to me without making a sound. The rational part of my brain, the part that had kept me alive so far, tried to offer explanations. Maybe another hiker had gotten caught in the storm too. Maybe they were lost like me and had spotted my tracks and decided to follow them. That would be smart, actually. 2 people have a better chance of surviving than 1. But if that were true, why had they not called out to me? Why had they stayed just out of sight, matching my pace? Close enough to leave prints beside mine, but never close enough to see. I started walking again, faster this time, and I made myself look down every few steps. The prints kept appearing. Left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot. Perfectly parallel to mine. Whoever this was, they were not falling behind or pulling ahead. They were staying exactly even with me, moving when I moved, stopping when I stopped. I tested it once, paused mid-step with my right foot still raised, and I swear I heard the faintest crunch in the snow to my left, like someone else had frozen in the same position. Then nothing, just the wind. I lowered my foot and kept going, and the prints continued beside me as if they had never stopped. I do not know how long I walked like that. Time stops making sense when you are cold enough and scared enough. It could have been 30 minutes or 2 hours. The snow kept falling, the wind kept screaming, and those prints kept appearing beside mine with mechanical precision. At some point I realized they were not just parallel anymore. They were angling inward, slowly, degree by degree, guiding my path to the left. I had not noticed it happening, but when I stopped to check my phone again, the compass showed I was now heading northwest instead of south, deeper into the backcountry, further from the road. Whoever was out there was not just following me, they were hurting me. I felt a surge of anger cut through the fear, hot and sudden. I was not going to die out here because some sick person wanted to play games. I forced myself to stop walking and think. The wind was coming from the west, which meant if I kept it on my right cheek, I would be heading south. Simple. I adjusted my direction and started moving again, deliberately ignoring the footprints now. I would not look at them. I would not let them guide me anywhere. But the prints changed too. They were no longer beside me. They were in front of me now, cutting across my path at a diagonal, forcing me to either step over them or veer left to avoid them. Every time I corrected my course, new prints appeared ahead, blocking me, redirecting me. It was like trying to walk through a maze that was being built around me in real time. I stopped again, and this time I screamed into the storm, a raw, wordless sound that tore at my throat. I demanded that whoever was out there show themselves. I called them a coward. I said things I'm not proud of, desperate things, begging things. The wind swallowed every word. And then, for just a second, the snow thinned enough that I could see maybe 50 feet ahead. There was a shape standing between two pine trees. A person. Tall, wearing dark clothing, completely motionless. I could not make out a face, just the outline of a body, a hood pulled up, arms hanging at their sides. We stood there looking at each other, or at least I think we did. And then the snow thickened again and they were gone. Something broke inside me after that. Not courage, I do not think I had any left by then, but the paralysis that had been building in my chest. Seeing them, actually seeing a real human shape standing there watching me, made it concrete. This was not my imagination. This was not hypothermia playing tricks on my brain. Someone was out here with me, and they did not want to help. They wanted something else. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the small canister of bear spray I always carried on hikes. It was not much, but it was something. I held it in my right hand with my thumb on the trigger and started walking again, this time moving as fast as I could without running. Running in deep snow is almost impossible anyway, and I needed to conserve energy. My legs burned. My lungs ached. I kept the wind on my right cheek like a lifeline and refused to look at the ground anymore. I did not want to see the prints. I did not want to know how close they were getting. I just focused on putting one foot in front of the other, counting my steps to keep from screaming. I had counted to somewhere around 300 when the trees opened up and I nearly walked off the edge of a ravine. I caught myself at the last second, grabbing a branch that scraped through my glove and tore the skin underneath. Below me was a drop of maybe 40 feet, rocky and steep, with a frozen creek at the bottom glinting dully through the snow. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth. I looked to my left, then to my right, trying to find a way around. The ravine stretched in both directions as far as I could see, which was not far, but far enough to know I could not just walk around it quickly. This was where they had been guiding me. This was the dead end. I spun around, expecting to see that dark figure emerging from the white, but there was nothing behind me except snow and silence. The footprints were there, though, a whole trail of them leading right up to where I stood, stopping maybe 10 feet away from me. Fresh, crisp, patient. Whoever this was, they had brought me here on purpose, and now they were waiting to see what I would do. I made a decision in that moment that probably saved my life. Instead of panicking, instead of trying to run along the edge of the ravine where the snow was deep and the footing was uncertain, I did the last thing they would expect. I went down. There was a section to my right where the slope was less steep, more of a sharp incline than a sheer drop, with exposed rocks and roots poking through the snow. I shoved the bear spray back in my pocket, turned around so I was facing the slope, and started climbing down backward, gripping whatever I could find. The rocks were slick with ice and my gloves made it hard to get a good hold. Twice my foot slipped and I slid several feet before catching myself, my jacket scraping against stone, my heart lodged somewhere in my throat. But I kept going. Halfway down, I heard something above me. Not the wind, something sharper. A sound like boots crunching on snow, fast, moving toward the edge of the ravine. I did not look up. I just moved faster, my arms shaking from the effort, my fingers numb even inside my gloves. When I finally reached the bottom, I landed hard on the frozen creek and felt the ice crack beneath my boots. But it held. I scrambled to my feet and looked up at the top of the ravine. There was a figure standing at the edge, looking down at me. The snow had thinned just enough that I could see them clearly for the first time. A man, I think, based on the build. Broad shoulders, tall frame, that same dark hooded jacket. He was not moving, just standing there with his hands at his sides, watching me. I could not see his face beneath the hood, but I felt his eyes on me like a physical weight. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then he took one step back from the edge and disappeared into the white. I stood there shaking, waiting for him to reappear somewhere else, waiting for him to find another way down. But the minutes passed and nothing happened. The storm continued to rage above me, but down in the ravine, the wind was blocked by the walls, and for the first time in hours, I could hear myself think. I pulled out my phone with trembling fingers, still no signal. But the compass still worked, and I knew that creeks flow downhill, and downhill meant civilization. I started walking along the frozen water, following its winding path through the ravine. And I did not stop until the walls began to shrink and the trees started to thin, and I saw, in the distance, the gray line of a road cutting through the snow. A pickup truck found me stumbling along the shoulder about 20 minutes later. The driver was an older man named Earl who worked for the county road maintenance crew. He said I looked like a ghost when he pulled over, pale and shaking and barely able to form words. He wrapped me in a blanket from his truck bed and cranked the heat up as high as it would go while I sat in the passenger seat and cried. I tried to tell him what happened, about the footprints and the figure and the ravine, but I was shivering so hard that my teeth kept chattering and the words came out jumbled and broken. He just nodded and drove me straight to the ranger station at the base of the mountain. The rangers took my statement, gave me hot coffee, and called search and rescue. A team went up the next morning after the storm cleared. They found my tracks leading off the main trail, found where I had descended into the ravine, found the frozen creek I had followed to the road. But they did not find any other footprints. The snow had covered everything. Or maybe there was nothing to find. I do not know. The ranger who spoke to me afterward said it was possible I had experienced mild hypothermia, that the cold can cause hallucinations and paranoia and confusion. She said it in a gentle voice, like she was trying to be kind. I nodded and thanked her and did not argue. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. I know those prints were real because I watched them appear beside mine, step by step, for what felt like hours. I know that figure was real because I saw him standing at the edge of that ravine, watching me, waiting. I filed a police report when I got back to Seattle, and they said they would look into it, but nothing ever came of it. No witnesses, no evidence, no suspect. Just another strange incident in the backcountry that could not be explained. I never went back to Snow Peak Trail. I have not gone hiking alone since that day, and I do not think I ever will. Sometimes at night, when the wind picks up outside my apartment window, I still think about that figure in the storm. I think about what would have happened if I had not climbed down that ravine. I think about where he was trying to lead me, and what was waiting there if I had followed. And I think about this, that somewhere out there, maybe right now, he is standing in the trees at the edge of some empty trailhead, watching another car pull into the parking lot, watching another woman lace up her boots and check her phone and head off alone into the white, and she has no idea he is there. Night shifts at a 24-hour laundromat teach you things about people that daylight never reveals. What happened to me on a Thursday in February 2018 still makes me check the locks twice before settling behind the counter. I had been working at Sudsy's Coin Wash on Belmont Road in Columbus, Ohio, for about 8 months by then. A gig I picked up after dropping out of community college the spring before, when paying rent became more urgent than earning credits. The place was nothing special. 12 industrial washers, 8 dryers, fluorescent lights that buzzed like angry insects, and a small office in the back where I spent most of my shift watching Netflix on my phone and occasionally helping customers with jammed machines. My shift ran from 11 at night until 7 in the morning, and most nights I saw maybe 4 or 5 people total. That Thursday, the weather forecast had warned about a polar vortex pushing temperatures down to -15 degrees, the kind of cold that kills homeless people and cracks car batteries in half. Around 2 in the morning, the laundromat was completely empty. The wind outside howled against the plate glass windows so hard I kept expecting them to shatter inward. I had just finished mopping the floor near the folding tables when I noticed a woman standing outside the front door, her face pressed close to the glass, her breath making little clouds of fog that disappeared almost instantly in the brutal air. She was wearing a thin jacket, not even close to appropriate for that weather, and no gloves. Her fingers were red, almost purple at the tips, and she was shivering so violently I could see her whole body trembling even through the door. She made eye contact with me and raised one hand in a weak wave, then pointed at the door handle. Company policy was clear. After midnight, the doors stayed locked and customers had to use the buzzer system. But looking at this woman, maybe in her late 40s with graying hair plastered to her forehead, and desperation carved into every line of her face, I knew I could not leave her out there to freeze. I walked over and unlocked the door, and she practically fell inside, bringing a wave of frozen air with her that made me gasp. She thanked me in a voice that was barely a whisper, her words cracking like ice breaking on a pond. Her name was Renee, she said, and her car had broken down about a mile up the road. She had been walking, trying to find somewhere open, anywhere with heat. Her phone was dead. She held it up to show me the blank screen, and she just needed to warm up and call her brother to come pick her up. It all made perfect sense. I told her she could sit in one of the plastic chairs near the dryers, where the residual heat made that corner the warmest spot in the building. I even offered her the cup of coffee I had been nursing, which she accepted with trembling hands. Watching her wrap her fingers around that styrofoam cup, I felt good about my decision. This was basic human decency. You do not let someone die of hypothermia because of a company policy written by people who had probably never worked a night shift in their lives. For the next 20 minutes or so, things were calm. Renee sat quietly, sipping the coffee, slowly regaining color in her cheeks and fingers. She asked if she could use the phone in my office to call her brother, and I said of course, leading her to the back. The office was small, barely bigger than a closet with a metal desk, a rolling chair, a safe bolted to the floor where I deposited the coin collections, and a corded phone that looked like it belonged in a museum. She dialed a number, spoke briefly to someone. I could hear a male voice on the other end but could not make out the words, and then hung up. Her brother was on his way, she told me, maybe 30 minutes out. She thanked me again, and I noticed that she was looking around the office as she spoke, her eyes moving slowly across the safe, the desk drawers, the small security monitor that showed grainy footage of the main floor. At the time, I thought nothing of it. She was probably just curious or bored or still disoriented from the cold. I walked her back to her chair by the dryers and returned to my spot behind the counter. About 15 minutes later, the buzzer rang. I looked up at the security monitor and saw a man standing outside, hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, shoulders hunched against the wind. He was tall, probably 6'3" or 4", with a shaved head and a thick beard that had frost clinging to it. I assumed this was the brother, arriving faster than expected. I glanced over at Renee, and she was already standing up, walking toward the door. But something about the way she moved caught my attention. She did not seem surprised or relieved the way you would expect someone to be when their ride finally shows up, after being stranded in deadly cold. Her pace was measured, almost casual, and she kept her eyes fixed on me rather than on the man outside. I pressed the button to unlock the door, and the man stepped inside, stamping his boots on the mat and blowing into his cupped hands. He nodded at me once, a quick jerk of his chin, but did not say thank you or offer any greeting. He walked straight past the counter and stood next to Renee near the dryers, and the two of them began speaking in voices too low for me to hear. I tried to go back to my phone, scrolling through social media without really seeing anything on the screen. But I could not focus. Something about the dynamic between these two people was making my chest tight, sending little prickles of unease down my spine. They were not acting like siblings. There was no hug, no expression of relief, no "thank God you made it" moment. They stood close together, almost shoulder to shoulder, their heads bent toward each other like conspirators. Every few seconds, one of them would glance in my direction, quick, furtive looks that they probably thought I did not notice. The man had not taken off his coat, had not sat down, had not done any of the things a person does when they arrive somewhere to wait. He was standing with his weight balanced on both feet, his posture rigid, like someone ready to move fast if needed. I started running through explanations in my head. Maybe they had a complicated relationship. Maybe he was angry about having to drive out in this weather. Maybe I was being paranoid because it was 3 in the morning, and I had been alone for hours. But none of those explanations quieted the alarm bells that were now ringing steadily in the back of my mind. The man broke away from Renee and started walking toward me. His boots were heavy, work boots with steel toes, and each step echoed against the linoleum floor like a slow drum beat. He stopped on the other side of the counter, close enough that I could smell cigarette smoke and something else underneath it, something sour like old sweat. Up close, I could see his eyes were pale gray, almost colorless, and they held no warmth whatsoever. He asked me if I had a bathroom he could use. I told him yes, pointing toward the short hallway that led to the restrooms near the back of the building. But he did not move in that direction. Instead, he leaned forward on the counter, his thick forearms pressing against the surface, and asked if the bathroom was near that office he had seen on his way in. I felt my throat tighten. The way he said it, that office, he's made it clear he had been paying attention, cataloging the layout of the building since the moment he walked through the door. I told him the bathroom was on the left, the office was on the right, and the office stayed locked. He smiled at that, a small curving of his lips that did not reach those dead gray eyes, and then finally turned and walked down the hallway. I watched him disappear around the corner, and immediately Renee appeared at the counter like she had been waiting for that exact moment. She leaned in close, closer than was comfortable, and I could see a small scar running through her left eyebrow that I had not noticed before. She asked me if I was here alone tonight. The question hit me like a bucket of ice water. I lied without hesitation, told her my manager was in the back doing inventory and would be out soon. Something flickered across her face, frustration maybe, or recalculation, and she glanced toward the hallway where the man had gone. She asked another question then, her voice still friendly but with an edge underneath it now, wanting to know what time my shift ended and if someone else would be coming in to relieve me. I told her 7, told her my coworker was always early, told her whatever lies I could think of to make this place seem less isolated than it actually was. She nodded slowly, processing this information, and then walked back toward the dryers without another word. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. These people were not here by accident. They were not stranded travelers waiting for a ride. They were here for something specific, and I was starting to understand exactly what that something was. The man came back from the hallway, but he did not return to where Renee was sitting. Instead, he walked directly to the office door and tried the handle. Just like that. No pretense, no excuse. He rattled it once, twice, then looked back at me with those flat gray eyes and asked if I could open it because he thought he left his phone in there when his sister made that call earlier. The lie was so transparent, it was almost insulting. I told him no, told him the office stayed locked and only the morning manager had the key. That was another lie. The key was in my pocket, had been there all night. but I delivered it with as much conviction as I could muster. He stared at me for a long moment, and I saw his jaw tighten, the muscles bunching beneath his beard. Then he turned and walked back to Renee, and the two of them had another whispered conversation. I used that moment to pull out my phone, keeping it below the counter where they could not see it. My hands were unsteady as I typed, my fingers clumsy on the screen. I pulled up the number for the local police precinct, not 911 because I did not know if this qualified as an emergency yet, but the non-emergency line I had saved months ago after a drunk customer threatened to break our windows. I kept my eyes on them while the phone rang, watching as the man walked back toward the office door. This time he did not bother with the handle. He planted his shoulder against the door and pushed, testing its strength, the wood groaning under the pressure. Renee was standing now too, positioned near the front entrance, and I realized with a sickening lurch that she was blocking my only way out. The phone clicked and a dispatcher answered, her voice bored and tired. I spoke as quietly as I could, told her my location, told her I had 2 people in the building who were trying to break into the back office, told her I was alone and scared. She asked me to stay on the line, told me officers were being dispatched, told me to stay calm and not to confront them. I almost laughed at that last part. Confrontation was the furthest thing from my mind. All I wanted was to survive the next however many minutes until help arrived. The man slammed his shoulder against the office door again, harder this time, and I heard the frame crack. Renee's head snapped toward the sound, then back to me, and our eyes met across the fluorescent-lit room. She knew I had made a call. She had to know. And the look on her face, cold, calculating, utterly devoid of the desperation she had performed so convincingly an hour ago, told me that the situation was about to change very fast. Renee said something sharp to the man, a single word I could not make out, and he stopped ramming the door. For a moment, everything was still. The buzz of the fluorescent lights, the distant rattle of the wind against the windows, the muffled voice of the dispatcher still talking in my ear. All of it seemed to fade into the background as the two of them stood there, frozen in what looked like indecision. Then the man reached into his coat pocket, and my entire body went rigid with fear. But what he pulled out was not a weapon. It was a phone. He looked at the screen, said something to Renee, and she cursed loud enough for me to hear it clearly across the room. Sirens. Faint at first, barely audible over the howling wind, but growing louder with each passing second. The man shoved his phone back in his pocket and strode toward the front door, not running but moving with purpose, his boots hammering against the floor. Renee followed right behind him, pausing only to look back at me one last time. There was no anger in her expression, no frustration at being thwarted, just a kind of blank assessment, like she was filing my face away for future reference. Then she pushed through the door and disappeared into the frozen darkness outside. The police arrived about 3 minutes later, 2 cruisers with their lights painting the snow-covered parking lot in alternating blue and red. I let them in with hands that would not stop trembling, and I told them everything. They searched the area but found no trace of Renee or the man. No abandoned car a mile up the road like she had claimed. No footprints in the snow leading anywhere useful, the wind having already erased whatever trail they left behind. The officers took my statement, examined the damage to the office door. The frame was cracked nearly in half. One more good hit, and it would have given way completely, and told me I had done the right thing by calling when I did. One of them, a woman with short gray hair and a calm, steady voice, said this was not the first time they had seen something like this. Teams of 2, she explained. One to play the victim and gain entry, the other to show up later and do the heavy lifting. They target isolated businesses during extreme weather, counting on the cold to make people sympathetic and careless. She said I was lucky. She said it could have gone much worse. I knew she was right, but knowing it did not make the shaking stop, did not make the image of Renee's final look fade from my memory. I quit that job 2 weeks later. Gave my notice the very next morning when my manager arrived and saw the splintered door frame, the police report on the counter, and me sitting in the corner with a cold cup of coffee I had not touched in hours. He understood, told me he would have done the same. I found work at a warehouse after that, day shifts only, surrounded by coworkers and forklifts and noise, the kind of job where you are never truly alone. It has been 6 years now, and I still think about that night more often than I would like to admit. Every time the temperature drops below zero, every time I see a news report about the homeless dying in the cold, every time someone knocks on a door late at night, I am right back in that laundromat, watching Renee press her face against the glass with those purple fingers and that performance of desperation that fooled me completely. I do not blame myself for letting her in. I think most people would have done the same thing, faced with a freezing woman begging for help in the middle of the night. But I learned something that Thursday in February, something that has stayed with me ever since. Kindness can be a door, and there are people in this world who spend their lives looking for someone willing to open it. My commute home from the warehouse usually takes about 40 minutes, but that night in January 2023, it was closer to an hour because of the ice. I had just turned 34 a week before, and my wife kept telling me I needed to find a job closer to home, something that did not require driving through rural stretches of road at 11 at night. She was right, of course. She usually is. But the pay was good, and we had just bought our first house, so I kept making that drive 5 nights a week through back roads that barely got any county maintenance during winter. That particular Wednesday, the temperature had dropped to maybe 15 degrees, and my Ford's heater was fighting a losing battle against the cold, seeping through the windows. I remember being tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from loading trucks for 10 hours straight. All I wanted was to get home, kiss my wife, and collapse into bed. I was about 20 miles from home, driving through a stretch of road that cuts between old farmland and dense patches of woods, when I saw the figure on the shoulder. At first I thought it was a deer, the way the shape just appeared in my headlights. But then I saw arms waving, and I realized it was a person, a woman, maybe in her 40s, wearing a dark coat that was way too thin for that kind of weather. She was standing next to what looked like an old Chevy sedan. The hood popped open, and she was flagging me down with both hands like her life depended on it. Now, I grew up in a small town. My parents taught me to help people when they need it. And out here, on a road like this with no cell service and temperatures that could kill you in a couple hours, leaving someone stranded was not something I could do. So I pulled over about 30 feet ahead of her car and put my hazards on. I sat there for a second, watching her in my rearview mirror as she jogged toward my truck. Something in my gut tightened, but I told myself I was being paranoid. She came up to my passenger window and I rolled it down halfway. The cold hit my face immediately, sharp and biting. Up close, I could see she was younger than I first thought, maybe early 30s with dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Her nose was red from the cold, and she was shivering hard, her teeth actually chattering when she spoke. She told me her car had died about an hour ago, and she had been waiting for someone to pass by. Said her phone was dead and she needed a ride to her brother's place, which was just a few miles down the road. She pointed vaguely into the darkness ahead, past where my headlights reached. I asked her if she wanted me to take a look at her car first, maybe try to jump it, but she shook her head fast and said it was no use, that the engine had been giving her trouble for weeks and it finally gave out for good. The way she said it, quick and dismissive, made me pause, but she looked genuinely cold, genuinely desperate, and I could not just leave her out there, so I unlocked the door and told her to get in. She slid into the passenger seat and immediately put her hands up to the heating vents, rubbing them together. She smelled like cigarettes and something else, something sour that I could not quite place. I asked her where exactly her brother lived, and she gave me directions that took us off the main road, onto a smaller one I had never used before. I knew the area well enough to know there were a few houses scattered out that way, old properties with long driveways hidden behind trees, so it did not seem impossible. But as I turned onto this narrower road, I noticed how the pavement got worse almost immediately. Patches of ice everywhere. No tire tracks ahead of us, no sign that anyone had driven through here recently. The woods closed in on both sides, branches hanging low and scraping against my truck as I drove. I slowed down to maybe 20 miles an hour because I could barely see where I was going. My headlights just got swallowed by the darkness ahead. And that was when she told me to keep going, that it was just a little further. Her voice had changed, not scared anymore, calm, almost flat. I glanced at her and she was not looking at me. She was staring straight ahead, her hands no longer rubbing together for warmth, just resting on her thighs. The shivering had stopped too, which struck me as strange because the heater in my truck was not that good, and she had been freezing just minutes ago. I asked her how much further, trying to keep my voice casual, and she just said soon. That was it. Soon. No other details, no landmarks to watch for, nothing. My grip on the steering wheel got tighter. I started thinking about how far we had come from the main road. Maybe 2 miles, maybe more. I had not seen a single house, not a single light through the trees. Just darkness and ice and this woman sitting next to me, who suddenly did not seem like the same person I had picked up. I thought about my wife at home, probably asleep by now, not knowing where I was. I thought about how no one would find me out here if something happened. That thought hit me hard, and I felt my chest get tight. Then I saw something that made my whole body tense up. On the left side of the road, maybe 50 feet ahead, there was a figure standing in the tree line. Just standing there, perfectly still, watching us pass. It was a man, I could tell by the build, wearing dark clothes that blended into the shadows. I only saw him because my headlights caught a flash of something reflective on his jacket, maybe a zipper or a button. I did not say anything, just kept driving, my eyes flicking between the road and my mirrors. And then I saw another one. On the right side this time, further back, but definitely there. Another person standing among the trees, facing the road. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I looked at the woman and she was still staring forward, her face completely blank like she was waiting for something. I knew right then that I had driven into something bad, something planned, and I needed to get out of there before it was too late. I did not think, I just acted. I slammed on the brakes and the truck skidded on the ice, fishtailing for a second before I got it under control. The woman grabbed the dashboard and finally looked at me, and her expression was not surprise or fear. It was anger. Pure, cold anger, like I had ruined something she had been working on. She opened her mouth to say something, but I was already throwing the truck into reverse. I hit the gas and we lurched backward, the tires spinning before they caught. She grabbed for my arm, her fingers digging into my jacket, yelling at me to stop, to wait, that I was making a mistake. But her voice was different now, urgent and harsh, nothing like the helpless woman I had picked up on the roadside. I shook her off and kept reversing, my eyes darting between the mirrors, trying to stay on the road. The branches scraped against the truck like fingers trying to hold us in place. I saw movement in my peripheral vision, shadows shifting between the trees, getting closer. She tried to grab the steering wheel then, lunging across the center console. I shoved her back with my elbow, harder than I meant to, and she hit the passenger door with a grunt. For a second our eyes met, and I saw nothing there. No humanity, no remorse, just frustration that her trap was falling apart. I reached across her and yanked the door handle, pushing the door open with my free hand while still trying to steer with the other. The cold air rushed in, and she grabbed onto the seat, screaming at me now, calling me names I will not repeat. I gave her one more shove and she tumbled out onto the icy road, rolling into the darkness. I did not wait to see if she was okay. I pulled the door shut and kept reversing until I found a spot wide enough to turn around. The whole time I could see figures emerging from the woods in my headlights, 3 of them, maybe 4, running toward the truck. They were close, too close. But I got the truck turned around and I floored it, the engine roaring as the tires fought for traction on the ice. I did not look back. I kept my foot on the gas and my eyes locked on the narrow road ahead, praying I would not slide off into a ditch or wrap the truck around a tree. The steering wheel jerked in my hands every time I hit a patch of ice, but I held on tight and kept going. It felt like forever before I finally saw the main road up ahead, that familiar stretch of pavement that would take me home. When my tires hit solid asphalt again, I let out a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. My whole body was shaking, not from the cold but from the adrenaline still pumping through me. I drove way over the speed limit the rest of the way home, constantly checking my mirrors for headlights behind me, expecting to see that old Chevy sedan following me. But there was nothing, just empty road and darkness. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the truck for a long time with the engine running, trying to calm down enough to go inside and face my wife without scaring her to death. I did not tell her everything that night. I could not. She was half asleep when I crawled into bed, and I just held her and stared at the ceiling until the sun came up. The next morning I called in sick to work and drove back out to that stretch of road in the daylight. I told myself I needed to see it again, needed to prove to myself that it really happened the way I remembered. The woman's car was gone. There was no sign anyone had ever been there. No broken glass, no tire marks in the slush, nothing. I drove slow down that side road where I had taken her, the one that led into the woods. In the daylight it looked almost peaceful, just a quiet country road with bare trees on either side. But about a mile in, I found what I was looking for. There was a clearing off to the right hidden from the road by a wall of brush, and in that clearing I could see tire tracks. Lots of them. The ground was all torn up, like multiple vehicles had been parked there recently. I did not get out of my truck to look closer. I did not need to. I knew exactly what that place was. It was where they had been waiting for me. I went to the police that same afternoon, sat in the station for 2 hours telling my story to a deputy who looked at me like I was making it all up. He wrote everything down, asked me a few questions, and said they would look into it. That was almost 2 years ago now. I never heard back from them, not once. I called a few times in the first couple months asking if there were any updates, if they had found anything. They always said the same thing, that there was no evidence of any crime, no reports of similar incidents in the area, nothing they could do. I tried to find news stories about carjackings or robberies on rural roads in our county, anything that might connect to what happened to me. I found nothing. It was like it never happened at all. But I know what I saw. I know what those people were planning to do. Sometimes at night when I cannot sleep, I think about what would have happened if I had kept driving down that road, if I had not seen those figures in the trees, if I had trusted that woman just a little bit longer. I think about the clearing with all those tire tracks, and I wonder how many people drove into those woods and never drove out. I do not take that route home anymore. I switched to a longer way that adds 20 minutes to my commute, but it stays on well-lit roads with more traffic. My wife knows the full story now. She cried when I told her, held on to me for a long time, made me promise to find a different job. I am still working on that, but some nights when I am driving home late and I see someone on the side of the road with their hazards on, I feel this sick twist in my stomach. I want to help. That is who I am, who I was raised to be. But I keep driving every single time I keep driving, and I hate myself for it a little bit, because maybe that person really does need help. Maybe their car really did break down and they are freezing and scared and alone. But I cannot stop. I will never stop again, because I know now that there are people out there who count on your kindness. They use it like a weapon, and the only reason I am here writing this is because I got lucky. I saw them before they were ready for me, that is it. That is the only reason I made it home that night. Just luck. And that thought keeps me awake more than anything else. "17 hours into a haul across the Dalton Highway in February, you start questioning every decision that brought you to this point. My graduating class back in 2009 had gone off to college, to office jobs, to lives with central heating and weekends off. And there I was, gripping a steering wheel at 2 in the morning while the Arctic tried its best to kill me. I drove freight for Kenworth Logistics out of Fairbanks, running loads up to Prudhoe Bay during the winter season when the ice roads opened, and the money got good enough to make a man forget common sense. On this run, I was hauling drilling equipment worth more than I would make in 5 years, creeping along at 20 miles an hour because the whiteout had turned the world into a wall of static. My rig was a Peterbilt 379 that I had named Rosemary after my grandmother, and she was the only thing between me and a frozen death in a ditch. The heater blasted on full, the wipers fought a losing battle against the snow, and somewhere behind all that white nothing, the sun would not rise for another 6 hours. I had made this run maybe 40 times over 3 winters, and I had never seen conditions this bad. The radio had been giving me trouble since I passed Coldfoot, crackling in and out like someone was playing with the dial from the other side. I kept trying to reach dispatch, kept trying to raise any of the other drivers who might be out on the road that night, but all I got was bursts of static punctuated by silence. The isolation up there was something people who have never driven those roads cannot understand. There is nothing for miles in every direction except tundra and ice and the occasional frozen creek bed. No cell service, no rest stops, no farmhouses with their lights on. Just the road, your headlights, and the howling wind that rocked your trailer like it was trying to tip you over. I had a satellite phone for emergencies, but when I checked it, the screen showed no signal, which was unusual because those things were supposed to work anywhere. I told myself the storm was interfering with the satellite, told myself it would clear up in an hour or 2. That was when I first saw the figure standing on the shoulder of the road, maybe 200 feet ahead, right at the edge of where my headlights could reach. I eased off the accelerator and let Rosemary slow down on her own, not wanting to brake hard on ice that I could not see beneath the packed snow. The figure was not moving, just standing there facing the road, and as I got closer I could make out more details. A dark parka with a fur-lined hood, no visible face, hands hanging at the sides. No vehicle anywhere nearby, no snowmobile. Nothing to explain how a person could be out here in the middle of a whiteout at 2 in the morning, 60 miles from the nearest outpost with a warm building. My first thought was that someone had broken down and walked until they could not walk anymore, that I was looking at a stranded driver minutes away from freezing to death. I started to pull over, my foot hovering over the brake, already running through the procedure in my head. Get them in the cab, crank the heat, radio for help once the signal came back. But something made me hesitate. The person was not waving, not flagging me down, not doing any of the things you would expect from someone desperate for rescue. They just stood there, motionless, like a mannequin someone had planted in the snow as a sick joke. I crept past at maybe 5 miles an hour, close enough that my headlights should have lit up their face, but the hood was angled down and all I could see was shadow. My side mirror caught the figure as I passed, still motionless, still facing the road like they were waiting for something. I told myself to stop, told myself that leaving someone out here was the same as leaving them to die, but my hands would not turn the wheel. There was something wrong with the way they stood, something unnatural about that perfect stillness in a wind that was gusting hard enough to rock my trailer. I watched the mirror as the figure shrank behind me, swallowed by the whiteout, and I felt a guilt that sat heavy in my chest. I grabbed the radio and tried again, hoping to report the sighting to someone, anyone, but all I got was that same dead static. The satellite phone still showed no signal. I was completely alone out there, and I had just driven past what might have been a dying person, because something in my gut told me not to stop. I replayed the image in my head over and over, the dark parka, the fur-lined hood, the hands hanging limp at the sides, and tried to convince myself I had made the right call. About 20 minutes later, the engine temperature gauge started creeping toward the red. Rosemary had never overheated on me before, not once in 3 years, and I knew immediately that something was wrong. I pulled over to the shoulder and killed the engine, listening to the wind scream against the cab while I waited for the temperature to drop. The protocol was simple. Let it cool, check the coolant, restart, and monitor. I had done it 100 times on other rigs, though never in conditions like this. Never when stopping meant exposing myself to air cold enough to freeze exposed skin in under a minute. I zipped my parka all the way up, pulled on my insulated gloves, and grabbed the flashlight from under the seat. The moment I opened the door, the cold hit me like a physical wall, stealing the breath from my lungs and making my eyes water instantly. I climbed down and walked to the front of the rig, my boots crunching on packed snow, the flashlight beam barely cutting through the swirling white. The coolant reservoir looked fine. The hoses were intact. I could not find any obvious reason for the temperature spike, which meant it was probably a sensor issue, something electrical glitching in the cold. I was about to climb back into the cab when I noticed the footprints. They were on the passenger side of the truck, a single line of boot prints in the fresh snow, leading from somewhere behind me toward the trailer. My flashlight followed them along the length of the rig, and they stopped right at the back doors of the trailer, like whoever made them had walked up and then just vanished. The snow was still falling hard enough that any prints would be covered within minutes, which meant these were fresh, made sometime in the last 20 minutes, while I had been sitting in the cab waiting for the engine to cool. I stood there staring at them, my breath coming out in thick white clouds, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was no one around. I had not heard anything, had not seen any headlights or movement. The road behind me was empty. The road ahead was empty, and the only sounds were the wind and the ticking of my cooling engine. But someone had walked up to my trailer while I sat inside, completely unaware, and then disappeared without a trace. I thought about the figure on the road, the one I had passed 20 minutes ago, and a cold that had nothing to do with the weather settled into my bones. I walked toward the back of the trailer, flashlight raised, half expecting someone to jump out at me from behind the wheels. The footprints led right up to the double doors and stopped there, but the seal on the trailer was still intact. The metal lock I had secured back in Fairbanks was exactly where I had left it, untouched and frozen solid. Whoever had walked up here had not tried to break in, had not tried to steal whatever was inside. They had just walked up, stood at the doors, and then what? I circled the trailer slowly, checking every shadow, every gap between the wheels, but there was no one. The wind howled and the snow swirled, and I was completely alone. I thought about following the footprints backward, tracing them to wherever they had come from, but the idea of walking away from my rig into that white nothing made my chest tight with fear. Instead, I hurried back to the cab, climbed inside, and locked both doors. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. I tried the radio again, desperate to hear another human voice, but the static was even worse now, a harsh crackling that sounded almost like interference from another signal. The engine had cooled enough to restart, so I fired up Rosemary and pulled back onto the road, pushing the speed as high as I dared in conditions that demanded caution. Every few seconds I checked my mirrors, watching for headlights behind me, watching for movement in the white wall that surrounded the truck. Nothing, just snow and darkness and the faint glow of my own taillights reflecting off the storm. I drove for maybe 10 miles, my grip on the wheel so tight my knuckles ached, before I noticed something that made me ease off the gas again. The trailer was swaying. Not the normal rocking you get from wind gusts or uneven road surface, but a rhythmic, deliberate swaying, like something inside was shifting its weight from side to side. I knew what I was hauling: drilling equipment, crates of machine parts, heavy industrial materials strapped down to pallets. None of it should be moving. None of it could move unless the straps had come loose, or unless someone was inside the trailer, pushing against the load. I watched the mirror and saw the trailer sway again, a slow pendulum motion that had no natural explanation, and I felt every hair on my arm stand up beneath my coat. I was not going to stop. That was the one thing I knew for certain. Whatever was happening back there, whoever was back there, they wanted me to pull over again. They wanted me outside the cab, exposed, vulnerable. The figure on the road had been bait, the engine trouble had been a trap, and now this swaying was another attempt to make me stop. I pushed the accelerator down and felt Rosemary surge forward, the speedometer climbing past 30, then 35, faster than anyone should drive on an ice road in a whiteout. The trailer kept swaying behind me, more violently now, like whoever was inside could feel me accelerating and was trying to throw off my balance. I gripped the wheel with both hands and kept my eyes locked on the narrow cone of visibility ahead, praying I would not hit a patch of black ice or a drift that would send me spinning off the road. The next checkpoint was Dead Horse, maybe 40 miles ahead, and if I could just make it there without stopping, I would be safe. There would be other people, other trucks, a place with lights and warmth and witnesses. I just had to keep driving and not look back. Then the banging started. It came from the roof of the cab directly above my head, a heavy, rhythmic pounding, like someone was up there slamming their fist against the metal. I jerked in my seat and nearly swerved off the road, my heart hammering so hard I could barely breathe. The banging continued, 3 hits, then a pause, then 3 more, a pattern that was too deliberate to be anything accidental. I tried to tell myself it was ice falling from an overpass, debris from the storm, anything but what it obviously was. But there are no overpasses on the Dalton Highway. There is nothing above you but sky and snow, and the occasional raven. Someone was on top of my truck, pounding on the roof while I drove through a whiteout at 40 miles an hour, and I had no idea how they had gotten there or what they wanted. I floored the accelerator and pushed Rosemary to 50, then 55, the trailer fishtailing behind me, the banging above me getting faster and more insistent. The radio crackled suddenly, and for one heart-stopping moment I thought I heard a voice, low, distorted, impossible to understand, before it dissolved back into static. I do not know how long I drove like that, speeding through a whiteout with someone on my roof and something in my trailer, both hands welded to the wheel, eyes burning from not blinking. It could have been 20 minutes or it could have been an hour. Time stopped meaning anything. The banging would pause for long stretches and then start again, sometimes directly above me, sometimes toward the back of the cab, like whoever was up there was crawling around, testing different spots. At one point I heard a scraping sound near the passenger window, metal on metal, and I looked over just in time to see something dark flash past the glass. A hand maybe, or a boot, gone before I could focus on it. I screamed, actually screamed out loud in the cab, and swerved hard enough that the trailer jackknifed for a terrifying second before I corrected. The road ahead was still nothing but white. The mirrors showed nothing but white, and the only proof I had that any of this was real was the pounding above me and the wild swaying behind me and the taste of copper in my mouth from biting my own tongue. Then, like a miracle, I saw lights. Faint at first, just a yellowish glow in the distance that I thought might be a hallucination, but they grew brighter as I pushed toward them. Dead Horse, the outpost. I could see the outline of buildings, the orange glow of sodium lamps cutting through the storm, the shapes of other vehicles parked in a lot. I laid on the horn and did not let go, blasting it over and over as I barreled toward the checkpoint, not caring if I woke every person within 10 miles. The banging on the roof stopped the moment the lights came into view. Just stopped, like someone had flipped a switch. The swaying in the trailer settled into the normal rhythm of road vibration. By the time I pulled into the lot and slammed the brakes, skidding to a stop in front of the main building, everything was quiet. I sat there for a long moment, engine running, doors locked, hands still gripping the wheel, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. Workers came out of the building drawn by my horn, and I watched them approach with flashlights, their faces confused and concerned. When I finally opened the door and stumbled out into the cold, I could barely speak. I just pointed at the roof, then at the trailer, and managed to say one word. Someone. They searched everything. A crew of 6 men with flashlights and crowbars went over every inch of my rig, while I sat inside the main building wrapped in a blanket, drinking coffee that I could not taste. They found scratches on the roof of the cab, long, deep gouges in the paint that had not been there when I left Fairbanks. They found a vent panel on the underside of the trailer that had been pried open, the screws stripped, and the metal bent inward like someone had forced their way through. The cargo inside was undisturbed, still strapped down exactly as I had loaded it, but there were wet boot prints on the floor of the trailer and handprints on the walls where someone had braced themselves against the swaying. No one was inside when they opened the doors. Whoever had been there was gone, vanished into the storm before the truck even came to a full stop. The police took my statement and told me that I was not the first driver to report something like this on the Dalton. There had been others over the years. Trucks found abandoned with no sign of the driver, rigs that arrived at checkpoints with damage no one could explain, reports of figures standing on the road in conditions no sane person would survive. They never caught anyone. They never found any bodies. They just had stories, dozens of them going back decades. I quit hauling ice roads after that night, turned in my notice to Kenworth the day I got back to Fairbanks, and never looked back. I drive local routes now, short hauls around the lower 48 where there are gas stations every 20 miles, and cell service never drops. The money is worse, but I sleep at night, which is more than I could say for the first 6 months after that run. I still think about it, though. I think about the figure standing on the shoulder of the road, motionless in a wind that should have knocked them flat. I think about the footprints that led to my trailer and stopped, about the banging on my roof and the hand, or whatever it was, that scraped past my window at 50 miles an hour. I think about the vent panel that had been pried open from the outside, and I wonder how long that person had been riding under my trailer before they climbed up. I wonder what would have happened if I had stopped when the trailer started swaying, if I had gotten out to check the cargo like any reasonable driver would. The police told me I did the right thing by keeping moving, that the outpost lights probably saved my life. I believe them. But some nights, when the wind picks up and the dark presses against my windows, I can still hear that rhythmic banging above my head, and I have to check the locks 3 times before I can close my eyes. Around 2 a.m. on a Thursday in February, I woke up because of the silence. That sounds weird, but anyone who has lived through a real winter knows what I mean. When you fall asleep with the heater humming and the refrigerator buzzing in the background, your brain gets used to that noise. It becomes white noise, almost like a lullaby. But when everything goes dead at once, that sudden absence of sound hits you harder than any loud bang. I sat up in bed, already feeling the cold creeping into the room. My phone was on the nightstand, and when I checked it, the screen showed 2:17 a.m. and a battery at 63%. No service bars. The power had gone out, and judging by how fast the temperature was dropping, it had been out for a while. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders and just sat there for a moment, trying to decide if I should get up or wait it out until morning. I had rented this place for 2 weeks to get some writing done away from the city. It was a small house about 40 minutes outside of Portland, Oregon, tucked at the end of a gravel road with maybe 3 other properties scattered along the way. My nearest neighbor was probably half a mile down. I had turned 34 the month before and decided I needed to finally finish the novel I'd been working on for 3 years. A friend of a friend owned this cabin and let me have it cheap for the off-season. It had seemed like such a good idea when I booked it. Quiet, isolated, peaceful. But sitting there in the pitch dark with no heat and no way to call anyone, peaceful was not the word that came to mind. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, pointing it around the bedroom. Everything looked normal. My laptop on the desk, my suitcase in the corner, the window showing nothing but black and the faint reflection of my own face staring back at me. I decided to check the rest of the house, mostly to make sure no pipes had burst or anything like that. The owner had warned me that the plumbing could be finicky in extreme cold, and the last thing I needed was to deal with water damage on top of everything else. I swung my legs out of bed and immediately regretted it. The floor was freezing, even through my thick socks. I found my boots near the door and shoved my feet into them without bothering to lace them up. The flashlight on my phone cut a narrow beam through the darkness as I walked down the short hallway toward the kitchen. The house was small, just a bedroom, a bathroom, a combined living room and kitchen area, and a tiny mudroom by the back door. It took me maybe 30 seconds to walk the whole thing. The fridge was silent, the stovetop cold, and when I flipped a light switch out of habit, nothing happened. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, listening. Outside, I could hear the wind pushing against the walls, but inside, there was nothing. Just my own breathing and the soft creak of the floorboards under my weight. That was when I decided to check the windows and doors. Not because I was scared at that point, but because it seemed like the responsible thing to do. If the power was out across the area, that meant no street lights, no porch lights, nothing. Total darkness outside. And I was a woman alone in a house I barely knew, in a place where I did not know anyone. It just made sense to double-check that everything was locked up. I started with the front door, which was secure. Then the 2 windows in the living room, both latched. The bathroom window, too small for anyone to fit through anyway, was locked. I saved the back door for last because it was in the mudroom, and the mudroom was the coldest part of the house. When I got there, I shined my light through the small window set into the door, expecting to see nothing but snow. And there was snow, a lot of it. It had been falling steadily since the evening before, but something about what I saw made me stop and look closer. The snow on the back porch had been disturbed, not like an animal had walked through it. More like someone had brushed it away from the door, clearing a path right up to the handle. I stood there staring at it for I do not know how long. My brain was trying to come up with explanations. Maybe the wind had done it. Maybe some snow had slid off the roof and created that pattern. But the more I looked, the less those explanations made sense. The snow had been pushed aside in a deliberate arc, almost like someone had used their arm or a sleeve to wipe it away from the door. And there were marks in the snow on the porch steps too. Not quite footprints because the snow was too powdery and had probably filled them in partially, but impressions. Depressions where someone had stepped. I felt my chest get tight, and I took a step back from the door, still holding my phone up with the flashlight pointed at the window. The lock on the door was a simple deadbolt, and I checked it twice to make sure it was engaged. It was, but that did not make me feel any better. Someone had been on that porch recently, probably within the last hour or two, based on how little snow had accumulated over the cleared area. Someone had walked up to my back door in the middle of the night during a blackout and tried to get a clear look at the handle. I backed out of the mudroom slowly, keeping my light aimed at the door like it might suddenly burst open. My mind was racing. I thought about calling 911, but when I checked my phone again, there was still no signal. Not even one bar. The house was in a bit of a dead zone to begin with, and whatever was happening with the storm must have knocked out the nearest cell tower or something. I thought about my car parked out front. I had the keys in my purse in the bedroom. I could grab them, run outside, and drive to the nearest gas station or anywhere with people. But that would mean going outside, into the dark, into the snow, where someone might be waiting. I did not know what to do. I turned off my flashlight to save battery and just stood there in the kitchen, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. The windows let in the faintest glow from the snow outside, just enough to see the outlines of furniture. I listened as hard as I could, trying to hear anything over the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. For a few minutes, there was nothing. Just the wind outside and the occasional creak of the house settling. I started to wonder if maybe I was overreacting. Maybe some drunk guy had wandered up to the wrong house and left when he realized his mistake. Maybe it was the property owner checking on the place and I just had not heard him knock. I was actually starting to calm down a little when I heard it. A soft sound from the back of the house, from the mudroom. It was not loud. It was not a bang or a crash. It was the quiet, careful sound of someone testing a door handle. A slow turn, then a pause, then another turn. Like whoever was out there was trying to see if the lock would give without making too much noise. I stopped breathing. I pressed myself against the kitchen counter and did not move. The sound stopped. I waited, counting the seconds in my head. 10, 20, 30. Nothing. Then I shifted my weight slightly to get a better angle toward the mudroom, and the floorboard under my foot let out a loud creak. The sound from the back door stopped instantly. That was when I understood. Whoever was out there was listening. They had heard me move, and now they were waiting to figure out where I was in the house. I felt sick. This was not some random drunk or a confused neighbor. This was someone who knew I was inside and was trying to get in without alerting me. I stayed frozen against the counter, barely breathing, for what felt like an eternity. My legs were shaking from holding still for so long. Then I heard footsteps outside, but not retreating. They were moving along the side of the house, crunching softly through the snow. Whoever it was, they were circling the building. I tracked the sound as it moved from the back toward the front, past the living room windows. I wanted to look, to see who it was, but I was terrified that if I moved toward the window, they would see the movement and know exactly where I was standing. So I just listened as the footsteps passed by, slow and deliberate, like someone taking their time. Like someone who was not in any hurry at all. The footsteps stopped somewhere near the front of the house. I waited, straining to hear anything. A full minute passed with nothing, then 2 minutes. I was starting to think maybe they had left when I heard the front door handle rattle. Not as gently as the back door. This time it was more forceful, like they were done being subtle. The door shook in its frame but held. I had locked it, thank God, and it was a solid wooden door with a good deadbolt. But the sound of someone actively trying to force their way in while I stood helpless in the dark was something I will never forget. I made a decision then. I moved as quietly as I could toward the bedroom, feeling my way along the wall with one hand. I did not turn on my flashlight because I did not want to give away my position. In the bedroom, I grabbed my car keys from my purse and the small kitchen knife I had been using to cut apples earlier that day. It was not much, but it was something. I crouched down beside the bed, putting my back against the wall so no one could come up behind me, and I waited. The rattling at the front door stopped after maybe 30 seconds. Then silence again. I do not know how long I sat there on the floor in the dark. It could have been 20 minutes or it could have been 2 hours. Time stopped making sense. Every tiny sound made my heart jump. The house creaking, the wind gusting, even my own breathing sounded impossibly loud. At some point, I heard the footsteps again, this time moving away from the house. I heard them crunch through the snow, getting fainter and fainter until I could not hear them at all. But I did not trust it. I kept thinking it was a trick, that whoever it was had just moved further away to wait for me to let my guard down. So I stayed exactly where I was, gripping that stupid little knife, watching the faint gray rectangle of the bedroom window for any sign of movement. The sky eventually started to lighten, just barely, that first hint of dawn turning the black into a dark blue. I had never been so grateful to see the sun coming up in my entire life. I stayed on that floor until there was enough light to see clearly, until I could look out the window and confirm that there was no one standing in the yard. When I finally got up, my whole body was stiff and aching from sitting in the same position for so long. The power was still out, but there was enough daylight now that I did not need my flashlight. I walked through the house, checking every window, every door. The front door showed scratches around the lock that had not been there before, deep gouges in the wood where someone had tried to pry it open. The back door was the same, with fresh marks around the deadbolt. I went outside through the front, staying close to the house, and walked around to check the perimeter. The snow told the whole story. There were footprints everywhere, circling the entire house multiple times, stopping at every window, clustering around both doors. Big footprints, probably a man based on the size. I followed them with my eyes as far as I could, and they led off toward the tree line behind the property and disappeared into the woods. I did not follow them. I went back inside, grabbed my stuff as fast as I could, and I was in my car and driving away within 10 minutes. I did not even lock the door behind me. I just left. I drove straight to the police station in the nearest town and told them everything. They sent someone out to the property, but by the time they got there, fresh snow had covered most of the footprints. They found the scratches on the doors and took some pictures, filed a report. The officer told me it was probably someone who knew the house was usually empty in winter and assumed no one was there. Maybe someone looking to steal whatever they could find, or just looking for a place to get out of the cold. They never caught anyone. I called the property owner and told him what happened, and he was shocked, said nothing like that had ever happened before. I did not go back to finish my 2 weeks. I did not ask for a refund. I just wanted to forget about it. But here's the thing that still keeps me up at night sometimes 3 years later. Whoever was out there, they were not just trying random doors. They cleared the snow from the handle before they tried it. They listened for my movements inside. They circled the house, checking every possible entry point, patient and methodical. and when they could not get in, they just walked away into the woods like it was nothing. I never saw a face, never heard a voice. I have no idea who it was or why they chose that house on that night, and I guess I never will. Greenleaf Copy and Print sat at the dead end of a strip mall on Route 17, one of those forgotten little shops that survived on loyalty and stubbornness more than actual foot traffic. I had been working there for about 8 months when this happened, running the front counter, helping customers with business cards and banners, occasionally taking passport photos for people who always seemed annoyed at how they turned out. My manager, Rich Oberlin, a stocky guy in his 50s who inherited the place from his father, called me around noon that Wednesday, asking if I could cover the closing shift. Stacy, the regular evening girl, had called in with some kind of throat infection that made her voice sound like gravel in a blender. At 24, still chipping away at student loans from a communications degree that had yet to prove useful, I grabbed every extra shift I could. The weather forecast mentioned snow, but nothing that sounded particularly threatening. When I pulled into the parking lot at 3 in the afternoon, the sky had that heavy, bruised look that upstate New York gets before something nasty rolls through. I should have paid more attention to that. By 5:30, what the radio called a significant winter weather event had buried the parking lot under a thick white blanket. The snow fell in dense curtains, reducing visibility to almost nothing, and the few cars that crept along Route 17 looked like ghosts drifting through fog. Rich checked in by phone, his voice cutting in and out through spotty reception, reminding me that the shop had never closed early in 18 years of operation. Small town reputation and all that. I told him I would stick it out until 9, already calculating the overtime in my head. The nail salon next door shut off its lights around 6, and I watched the owner sprint to her car with her coat pulled over her head, tires spinning briefly before she disappeared into the white. After that, I had the entire strip mall to myself. The heating system kept the front area comfortable enough, though I knew the back rooms, the storage area, and the old break room that nobody used anymore ran about 10 degrees colder. For 2 hours, I sat behind the counter with a paperback novel, listening to the wind rattle the plate glass windows and watching snowdrifts climb higher against the doors. Not a single customer, not even a phone call, just me and the hum of fluorescent lights and the storm howling outside like something hungry. Around 7:15, I decided to make myself some coffee in the break room. The shop had a small layout that I knew by heart. The front counter and customer area took up maybe a third of the space, with the big copiers and printing equipment filling the middle section. Behind that, a narrow hallway led to the storage room on the left, the break room on the right, and a back door at the very end that opened onto a small loading area behind the building. That back door had been stuck for years, painted shut according to Rich, and nobody ever bothered fixing it since we received all our deliveries through the front. I grabbed my empty mug and walked past the row of silent machines, their display screens dark and waiting. The break room was nothing special, just a mini fridge, a microwave crusted with old spaghetti stains, a wobbly table with 3 mismatched chairs, and a coffee maker that had probably been there since the Clinton administration. I flipped the light switch, and the single bulb flickered twice before catching. The room felt colder than usual, which I blamed on the storm, and the fact that the heating vents back here had never worked properly. While the coffee brewed, I leaned against the counter and scrolled through my phone, half reading a news article about the storm causing accidents on the interstate. The smell of cheap coffee filled the small room, mixing with that particular mustiness that old buildings develop over decades. That was when I heard it for the first time. A soft thump from somewhere deeper in the building, coming from the direction of the storage room. I stopped scrolling and listened, holding my breath without really meaning to. Nothing, just the coffee maker gurgling through its final cycle and the muffled roar of wind outside. I told myself it was probably something falling off a shelf, maybe a stack of paper boxes that had been piled too high. The storage room was packed with years of accumulated inventory that Rich never bothered to organize. I poured my coffee, added 2 packets of sugar, and headed back to the front counter. The hallway seemed darker than before, though I knew that was just my imagination playing tricks. When I passed the storage room door, I noticed it was slightly ajar, maybe 2 inches of black space visible between the door and the frame. I could have sworn it had been closed when I walked by earlier. I hesitated for a moment, then reached out and pulled it shut until I heard the latch click. Old buildings shift and settle, especially in extreme cold. Doors drift open sometimes. I repeated that to myself as I walked back to the front, gripping my warm mug a little tighter than necessary. The next hour passed without incident, and I started to relax again. I finished a chapter of my book, checked the weather radar on my phone, and watched the snow continue to pile up outside. The drifts against the front door had reached nearly 2 feet, and I started to worry about whether my old Subaru would even make it out of the parking lot when closing time came. Around 8:20, I got up to stretch my legs and decided to walk the perimeter of the shop, partly out of boredom, and partly because something at the back of my mind kept nagging at me about that storage room door. The front area looked exactly as it should. The counter clean, the display racks undisturbed, the windows showing nothing but swirling white. I moved past the copiers and printers, running my hand along their smooth surfaces, listening to the building creak and groan under the weight of accumulating snow. When I reached the hallway, I stopped. The storage room door was open again. Not just slightly ajar this time, but wide open, revealing the darkness inside like a mouth waiting to swallow something. I stood there for what felt like a full minute, staring into that black rectangle. The storage room had no windows, no source of natural light, and the single bulb inside was controlled by a pull chain that hung from the ceiling about 6 feet in. I could see the vague outlines of shelving units and stacked boxes, but nothing moved, nothing made a sound. My heart had started beating faster, and I became very aware of how alone I was, how far from any other person. The rational part of my brain kept insisting there had to be an explanation. Maybe the latch was broken. Maybe the door frame was warped from age and temperature changes. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, aiming the beam into the storage room. Boxes of printer paper, toner cartridges, old promotional signs that Rich refused to throw away, rolls of vinyl for the banner printer. Everything looked undisturbed, coated in a thin layer of dust that sparkled in the light. I took 2 steps inside, reaching up for the pull chain, and that was when I noticed the footprints. They were faint, barely visible in the dust on the concrete floor, but they were definitely there. A trail of shoe prints leading from the back corner of the room toward the door where I now stood. Someone had walked through here recently, someone wearing what looked like work boots size 10 or 11 from the shape of them, and the prints only went one direction, toward the front of the store, which meant whoever made them was still inside the building. My first instinct was to run straight for the front door and get out, but something stopped me. The snow outside had to be 3 feet deep by now, and my car was parked at least 50 yards away. If someone was in here with me, and if that someone meant harm, I would be wading through knee-deep snow in the dark while they watched from the warm interior. I backed out of the storage room slowly, keeping my phone light aimed ahead of me, trying to control my breathing. The break room door was closed exactly as I had left it earlier. The back door at the end of the hallway, the one Rich said was painted shut, looked the same as always. But when I walked closer, holding my breath, I noticed something that made my legs feel weak. The door frame near the latch had fresh scratches in the paint, bright white marks against the dull cream color, and the door itself sat slightly crooked in the frame. Someone had forced it open from the outside. The snow on the small concrete pad behind the building would have covered any tracks within minutes, which meant this person could have entered hours ago, long before the storm got bad enough to trap us both inside. I retreated to the front counter as quietly as I could manage, my sneakers barely making a sound on the thin commercial carpet. My mind raced through the layout of the shop, trying to figure out where someone could hide. The storage room seemed clear, at least the main area. The break room was too small to conceal anyone for long, but there was another space I had forgotten about, a narrow utility closet built into the wall between the copier area and the hallway, where Rich kept cleaning supplies and a few old machines that no longer worked. The door to that closet blended almost seamlessly with the wall paneling, easy to miss if you did not know it was there. I'd only opened it twice in 8 months, once to grab a mop when a customer spilled coffee, and once when Rich asked me to find a specific replacement part for one of the printers. I stared at that section of wall from behind the counter, my phone clutched in one hand, trying to remember if I had noticed anything unusual when I walked past earlier. The closet door had a small brass handle, tarnished almost black with age, and from this distance I could not tell if it was fully closed or slightly open. I did not want to find out. I needed to call for help, but when I looked at my phone, the signal had dropped to a single flickering bar. The storm must have been interfering with the cell towers, or maybe the snow was just too thick for anything to get through. I tried calling 911 anyway, pressing the phone hard against my ear, but all I got was static and silence, not even a ring. My second thought was the landline on the counter, an old beige phone that Rich kept for backup and rarely used. I picked up the receiver and heard nothing, just dead air. The phone lines must have gone down with the storm, buried under ice and snow somewhere between here and town. I was completely cut off, alone in a building with someone who had broken in and hidden themselves for hours, watching me go about my evening without any idea they were there. The thought of it made my skin prickle with something between fear and revulsion. I pictured myself making coffee, reading my book, checking my phone, all while a stranger lurked somewhere in the shadows, studying my movements, waiting for something. Waiting for what exactly? That question terrified me more than anything else because I had no way of knowing the answer. A sound broke the silence, and this time it was unmistakable. Not a thump or a creak, but a slow, deliberate footstep coming from the hallway. Then another. Someone was walking toward the front of the store, not even trying to be quiet anymore. I ducked behind the counter, pressing my back against the wooden panel, and grabbed the only thing within reach that could serve as a weapon, a heavy-duty paper cutter with a long metal blade. The footsteps stopped somewhere near the copiers, maybe 20 feet from where I crouched. I could hear breathing now, slow and even, the sound of someone completely calm. My own breath came in shallow gasps that I tried desperately to muffle with my hand. Through a small gap between the counter and the wall, I could see a sliver of the shop floor, just enough to catch movement if anyone walked past. For a long moment, nothing happened. The breathing continued, steady as a metronome, and I realized with horrible clarity that this person knew exactly where I was. They had probably watched me duck behind the counter. They were standing there in the middle of my workplace, in no hurry at all, enjoying the fact that I was trapped and terrified and completely at their mercy. Then headlights swept across the front windows, bright and sudden, cutting through the snow like a miracle. A truck had pulled into the parking lot, its engine rumbling loud enough to penetrate the glass. I heard the footsteps behind me move quickly, retreating back toward the hallway, no longer slow or deliberate, but fast and urgent. Without thinking, I stood up and screamed, waving my arms at the truck outside. Not even words really, just raw noise coming out of my throat. The truck stopped about 30 feet from the door, and I saw a figure climb out, bundled in a heavy coat, wading through the snow toward the entrance. Behind me, I heard the back door slam, the one that was supposed to be painted shut, and then nothing. I ran to the front door and shoved it open against the snowdrift, cold air hitting my face like a slap, and nearly tackled the man coming toward me. His name was Earl, I learned later, a driver for a tow company who had been looking for a place to wait out the worst of the storm before continuing on to a call. He said I looked like I had seen death itself, pale and shaking and barely able to form sentences. I told him someone had been inside with me, that they had broken in through the back, and he helped me search the building while keeping his own tire iron ready. We found the utility closet door standing wide open, and inside, shoved behind a broken laminator, there was a backpack that did not belong to anyone at the shop. Earl pulled it out carefully, using his gloved hands, and we looked inside together. A change of clothes, a hunting knife with a 6-inch blade, a roll of duct tape, a small flashlight, and a burner phone with no contact saved. There was also a folded piece of paper with the shop's hours written on it, along with a note in messy handwriting that said, Wed night, one girl alone. Earl called the police from his truck radio, and they arrived about an hour later after the plows had cleared enough of Route 17 to get through. The officers took the backpack as evidence and told me I was lucky, though they used a different word that I will not repeat here. They found boot prints in the snow behind the building, leading toward the woods about a quarter-mile away, but the storm had filled them in before they could follow the trail. They never caught whoever it was. I quit the job 2 days later and moved back to my parents' house in Connecticut for a few months, until I could stop jumping at every unexpected sound. Sometimes I still think about that note, about how someone had been watching the shop long enough to know the schedule, to know that Wednesday nights meant one employee working alone until 9. I think about the hours I spent reading my book and drinking coffee, while a stranger with a knife and duct tape waited in the dark, 10 feet away from me, breathing slowly and watching through the crack in a closet door. And I wonder what would have happened if Earl had decided to wait out the storm somewhere else. Living alone had never bothered me before that winter. At the time, my name was Clara, and I had rented a remote house miles away from the nearest town to save money and clear my head. Work was remote, life was quiet, and isolation felt like a luxury instead of a threat. Snowstorms were common in that region, and I had stocked up the way everyone told me to. The forecast mentioned heavy snow, nothing unusual, and I remember feeling almost excited for the forced stillness. That morning, the world outside was already muted, wrapped in thick white silence. Wind dragged loose snow across the yard like smoke. Inside, the house creaked the way old places do when temperatures drop. By late afternoon, the storm had grown teeth. Snow piled against the doors faster than I could shovel, and the road disappeared completely. Phone signal flickered in and out, and the power died without warning, plunging every room into an early dusk. The heater shut down, leaving only the faint tick of cooling pipes. Candles became my new light sources, their flames bending whenever the wind slammed the siding. I kept telling myself this was normal, just a rough storm passing through. Still, the silence between gusts felt too deep, like the house was holding its breath. Every sound carried weight in a way it never had before. The first impact came just after dark. A dull thud against the outer wall, low and heavy, followed by another closer to the back of the house. Ice chunks falling from the roof made sense, and so did wind-driven debris, so that's what I told myself. The noises repeated, irregular but deliberate enough to pull my attention every time. Each hit seemed to test a different section of the house. I paced from room to room listening, trying to map where the sounds came from. The storm howled loudly enough to blur everything together, yet those impacts stood out, sharper somehow. I avoided the windows, uneasy about what I might see beyond the glass. Eventually, curiosity won. One candle in hand, I approached the living room window, wiping condensation from the inside with my sleeve. Snow covered most of the glass, pressed high and thick, but something darker caught my eye. A shape stood out where the snow thinned, uneven and unsettlingly familiar. The impression looked like fingers splayed wide, pressed flat against the outside of the window. Before I could fully process it, the mark vanished as snow slid back into place. Moments later, another impact struck the opposite side of the house. That's when the realization set in that whatever was out there wasn't random, and it wasn't staying in one place. Night pressed in hard after that. Candles burned lower, and the cold crept across the floors in slow, numb waves. The impacts kept coming, spaced out just enough to prevent any rhythm, like whoever or whatever was outside didn't want me getting used to it. Wind alone couldn't explain how the sounds shifted from wall to wall. At one point, the noise came from right beside the front door, close enough that I could hear snow sliding down afterward. I stood in the hallway listening, counting breaths without realizing I was doing it. The house felt smaller with every passing minute. Even the ceiling seemed closer, as if the storm were pressing everything inward. Another window showed signs not long after. Frost scraped away from the outside in a rough oval, followed by a second hand-shaped mark beside it. The fingers were long, uneven, and left clear grooves in the snow deep enough to show pressure. They didn't linger, never staying long enough for me to study them properly. Each time I tried to get closer, the marks faded, replaced by fresh snowfall as if nothing had been there. The storm worked like a curtain, hiding movements between gusts. Whoever was circling the house knew that. The idea settled in slowly and refused to leave. The banging changed tone after that, growing more controlled, less chaotic. One strike landed near the kitchen, followed by another near the bedroom, spaced as if someone were walking the perimeter. My phone finally lost signal completely, leaving me with a dead screen and no outside connection. The temperature inside dropped fast enough that I could see my breath. Layers of clothing barely helped, and my focus narrowed to staying warm and alert. Footprints never appeared in the yard, but the snow kept shifting near the foundation. Something out there was close enough to disturb it, yet hidden well enough to stay unseen. Eventually, exhaustion forced a decision. The safest room was the pantry, small and buried toward the center of the house. Blankets, canned food, and one remaining candle came with me as I shut the door. The impacts continued for hours, sometimes closer, sometimes distant, until the storm's roar swallowed them entirely. At some point, the sounds stopped altogether, leaving only wind and settling ice. Morning light filtered faintly through the cracks when the blizzard finally eased. No marks remained outside, no damage, no tracks, just untouched snow. Roads reopened days later, and I left as soon as possible, never returning, still unsure who had been waiting for the storm to trap me inside. Morning didn't arrive the way it usually does. There was no clean sunrise, just a gradual thinning of darkness as the storm loosened its grip. I stayed in the pantry longer than necessary, listening for anything that didn't belong. When I finally opened the door, the house felt wrong in a different way. Too quiet, like a space after a loud argument. The air inside was bitterly cold, and every step sent sharp cracks through the floorboards. I moved room to room slowly, candle held out in front of me, checking windows, doors, corners. Everything looked intact, no broken glass, no forced entry. That somehow made it worse. Outside light revealed more than I wanted. Snow had piled almost to the windows, smooth and undisturbed except in a few places where it looked handled. Near the living room window, the surface wasn't wind-shaped. It was flattened in patches, uneven, like someone had leaned there and then stepped back. The impressions were faint but intentional, pressed deeper than drifting snow would allow. I scanned the yard as far as I could see through the remaining haze, half expecting movement. Nothing stirred. No tracks led away, no signs of departure. The storm had erased everything except those subtle disruptions near the house itself. I forced the front door open with effort, snow resisting like it wanted me to stay inside. Cold air rushed in, sharp and metallic, carrying that empty post-storm stillness. I stood there for a long moment, listening again, exposed and shaking for reasons beyond the temperature. The walls that had felt like protection hours earlier now seemed thin and unreliable. Whatever had been outside had chosen not to come in, and that choice bothered me more than if it had tried. The thought that someone had tested the house and decided against entering stayed with me, heavy and unresolved. Once the roads were cleared later that day, I packed what I could and left before night had a chance to settle again. I didn't wait for explanations or reassurance from anyone else. The house returned to being just a structure in the snow, silent and empty. Even now, years later, I replay that day in fragments. The timing of the impacts, the way the marks appeared and vanished, the precision of it all. I still don't know who was outside or why the storm mattered so much to them. I only know that something used the weather as cover, and I was never meant to see it clearly. Winter mornings near my place were usually quiet enough that I could hear my own boots compressing the snow. At that point in my life, I was living alone in a small rental on the edge of town, working irregular hours and using long walks to clear my head. The trail behind my neighborhood wasn't anything official, just a worn path locals used to cut through the trees. That day, the air had that sharp, dry cold that makes your nose sting with every breath. I remember debating whether to go out at all because the ground was slick and the sky looked heavy. Still, I needed the movement, the routine, something normal. I zipped my coat up to my chin and headed toward the tree line, expecting nothing more than silence and frozen branches. About 15 minutes in, I noticed someone ahead of me on the trail. That alone wasn't strange, but the way they were dressed caught my attention immediately. No gloves, no hat, and a thin jacket that looked more like something you'd wear in early fall. Their steps were slow and uneven, almost dragging, leaving shallow marks in the snow. Every few seconds they paused, as if listening for something behind them. I slowed my pace without fully realizing why, keeping a steady distance. The woods around us were dense, darker than usual, the kind that swallows sound. I remember thinking how exposed that person must be to the cold, yet they didn't seem bothered. The path split near a fallen tree, with the main trail curving back toward the neighborhood. Instead of following it, the person ahead veered toward an area marked with old warning signs nailed to trunks. Most locals avoided that section because it bordered protected land, and the terrain dropped off sharply. The person didn't hesitate, stepping over the thin rope barrier like it wasn't there. I stopped completely, my breath fogging the air, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to call out, maybe warn them, but my voice wouldn't come. The quiet felt heavier than before, like the forest was holding it in. After a long moment, I turned back, uneasy and annoyed at myself for letting a stranger rattle me. Weeks passed and the memory faded into something I only thought about when I walked that way again. Then one evening, flashing lights lit up the road near my place, painting the snow in red and blue. Law enforcement vehicles were parked along the trail entrance and officers were moving in and out of the trees. Later, word spread that they were searching the restricted area because of an unrelated investigation. Nobody mentioned a person on the trail or anything unusual found that day. Still, standing at my window, watching the lights flicker against the forest, that image of the underdressed figure came rushing back with uncomfortable clarity. It felt like a piece of something larger I had brushed against and never understood. The following days changed how I moved through that part of town. The trail stayed open, but the casual rhythm it once had was gone. I found myself scanning the tree line more than the ground, noticing things I'd ignored for years. Broken branches piled in odd places, faint tracks that didn't match boots or animals, scraps of fabric snagged on thorns. I kept replaying the way that person had crossed into the restricted area so calmly, like they'd done it before. There was no sense of urgency in their movements, no rush to get somewhere warm. That detail bothered me more than anything else. Cold like that usually forces decisions, but they had moved with patience, almost intention. Eventually, curiosity pushed me to ask around. At a small local diner, I overheard two older men talking about the police activity. They spoke in hushed tones, mentioning thefts, illegal dumping, and something about makeshift shelters deep in the woods. One of them joked about people hiding where nobody wanted to look. I sat there stirring my coffee long after it went cold, realizing how close that hidden area was to my daily routine. I thought about how easily I'd followed the stranger's path with my eyes, how natural it felt to watch them drift away from safety. It unsettled me to admit how close I'd come to stepping past those signs myself. Sleep didn't come easily for a while after that. Every creak outside my window sounded amplified. Every gust of wind felt deliberate. I started locking my doors earlier than usual and stopped using the trail altogether. Once, during another walk closer to town, I spotted a piece of rope half buried in snow that looked identical to the barrier near the restricted area. I couldn't say for sure it was the same, but seeing it there sent a jolt through me. It made me wonder how many markers I'd missed before, how many times I'd crossed paths with things just outside my awareness. The idea that danger didn't announce itself weighed heavily on me. Eventually, the police presence disappeared, and life resumed its usual pace. No official statements reached us beyond vague reassurances. Still, that winter walk stayed with me, reshaping how I thought about familiar places. I learned that proximity doesn't equal safety, and routine can blind you to quiet warnings. Even now, years later, I avoid wooded shortcuts during colder months. I don't know who that person was or why they were there, and maybe I never will. What I do know is that noticing them changed something permanent in me, a subtle shift toward caution that hasn't faded with time. Spring eventually softened the edges of that winter, but it didn't erase what had happened. I remember the first time the snow fully melted and the ground turned to mud, exposing things that had been hidden for months. From the road, I could see where the forest floor had been disturbed in the restricted area, darker patches where people had clearly been moving back and forth. It made the whole thing feel more real, less like a strange memory, and more like a near miss. I realized how thin the line was between a normal habit and a dangerous situation. All it took was one step off a familiar path. Not long after that, a short article appeared on a local news site. It talked about arrests connected to illegal activity tied to the forest, mentioning stolen property and individuals using the area to stay out of sight. The report was vague and careful, probably to avoid panic, but it confirmed enough to make my chest tighten. They included a photo taken from the edge of the woods, showing debris and a narrow footpath that looked exactly like the one I'd seen that day. I stared at that image for a long time, tracing the route with my finger. It finally clicked that the person I'd followed with my eyes hadn't been lost or careless. They'd known exactly where they were going. That realization brought an unexpected mix of relief and dread. Relief that I hadn't called out, hadn't followed, hadn't tried to be helpful. Dread because it meant I'd unknowingly been close to something deliberate and hidden. I started sharing the story quietly with a few friends, framing it as a strange coincidence rather than anything dramatic. Most of them brushed it off, saying things like that happen everywhere. But a couple went quiet, especially those who also used trails near their homes. It was unsettling to see that same shift of awareness pass to them, the same pause before they spoke. In the end, the solution was simple and practical. I stopped using that trail altogether and adjusted my routines. I found busier routes, places with open sightlines and people around. The forest is still there, unchanged, and I still pass it sometimes on my way to work, but I don't feel drawn to it anymore. That single winter walk taught me that familiarity can be misleading, and not every quiet place is empty. I don't know what would have happened if I'd taken a few more steps forward that day. What matters is that I didn't, and that choice still feels like the right one. Working remotely during a harsh winter had become my routine by then, especially with deadlines piling up and the days getting shorter. At that point in my life, I was living alone in a small 2-story house, trying to save money and keep my head down. Snow had been falling on and off for days, the kind that muffles everything outside and makes the house feel sealed off from the world. That evening, my job kept me glued to my desk, headset on, juggling calls and reports while the heater hummed non-stop. I remember feeling oddly grateful for the isolation, like the storm had given me an excuse to disappear for a while. The house was quiet in a way that felt heavy, not peaceful, but I brushed that thought aside. I told myself it was just winter doing what winter does, pressing in from all sides. Nothing about that night seemed special yet, just another long shift at home. The first sound slipped past my headphones like a mistake, something soft and brief that didn't belong to the audio in my ears. I paused the call, lifted one side of the headset, and listened, expecting the heater or the pipes. What I heard instead was closer, like a faint scrape, the kind you'd get from fabric brushing a wall. I stood up and checked the hallway, finding everything exactly as I'd left it. Every door on the ground floor was closed, lights off, shadows sitting where they should. Back at my desk, I chalked it up to fatigue and put the headset on again. Minutes later, another noise came through, heavier this time, like a slow step being placed carefully. My focus started slipping, but I forced myself to finish the task in front of me. I didn't want to admit how alert I'd become to every tiny sound. As the night dragged on, those subtle noises kept returning, always just quiet enough to make me question whether they were real. Sometimes it sounded like a door shifting slightly, sometimes like something brushing past furniture. Each time I checked, the house looked normal, almost staged in its stillness. Near the end of my shift, I got up to refill my mug and noticed the door to the guest room standing open. I clearly remembered closing it earlier because the draft from the window made it rattle. The bathroom door down the hall was open too, angled in a way I never leave it. Standing there, mug forgotten in my hand, I felt a creeping sense of unease settle in my chest. I walked through the house, closing each door again, paying attention to the sound of the latches clicking. When I returned to my desk, the silence felt louder than before. Sleep didn't come easily after I logged off, and the house felt wrong in a way I couldn't put into words. The next morning, still bothered, I checked the security camera app on my phone, more out of curiosity than fear. The footage from the previous night showed subtle movement during my working hours, shadows shifting and doors changing position on their own. At one point, the guest room door eased open slowly, like someone careful was controlling it. There was no clear figure, no obvious person, just motion where there shouldn't have been any. I replayed the clips again and again, scanning for an entry point, a window, anything that made sense. Every lock had remained secured the entire time, according to the system. Sitting there with my phone in my hand, I realized those sounds hadn't been my imagination at all. I spent the rest of that morning walking through the house with a notepad, writing down what the cameras had actually captured. Each clip showed the same rooms I had checked in person, yet the timing didn't line up with my memory. The hallway light flicked on briefly at one point, even though I hadn't touched the switch all night. In another clip, the door to the storage closet shifted inward, stopped, then slowly returned to its original position. No sudden movements, no rush, just patience. That detail bothered me more than anything else. Whatever caused it wasn't careless or accidental. It behaved like it knew the house, like it understood how little force was needed to avoid making noise. Later that day, I called a friend named Lucas to come over, mostly because I didn't want to be alone with my thoughts. We went over the footage together on my laptop, frame by frame, pausing and rewinding until my eyes hurt. Lucas tried to joke at first, suggesting drafts or pressure changes from the cold, but his tone changed as the clips kept playing. He pointed out how consistent the movement was, always during my work hours, always stopping when I stood up from my desk. We checked every window, every vent, even the attic access, finding nothing disturbed. The snow outside was untouched except for my own footprints from earlier that morning. Seeing his confidence fade made the situation feel heavier, more real. That night I worked again, though I didn't put my headphones on this time. Every sound felt amplified without them, from the heater cycling to the faint tick of the walls contracting. I positioned my desk so I could see the hallway clearly, keeping the doors in view. Hours passed without incident, and part of me started hoping the previous night had been a one-time thing. Near the end of my shift, a soft click echoed through the house, unmistakable and deliberate. The bathroom door, which I had locked, eased open by a few inches and stopped. I didn't move, barely breathing, watching it like staring at an animal that might bolt if startled. After a long minute, it closed again, gently, leaving the latch exactly where it had been. The next day, I contacted a security technician to review the system in person. He confirmed there were no glitches, no remote access, and no signs of tampering. Before leaving, he suggested adding motion sensors inside the house, something I agreed to immediately. After they were installed, the unexplained activity stopped completely. No more sounds, no doors shifting, no movement on camera. Even so, I didn't relax. I moved my workspace into the living room and kept interior doors open from then on. To this day, I still don't know what caused those hours of quiet movement while I worked. All I know is that whatever it was seemed aware of me, and once it realized I was watching back, it never returned. That week ended with a strange kind of quiet settling into the house, the kind that doesn't feel earned. Work returned to normal. Deadlines came and went, and the cameras showed nothing but empty rooms and steady timestamps. Even so, habits had changed without me really choosing them. Lights stayed on longer than necessary, and I caught myself listening before stepping into any room. The motion sensors never triggered, not once, which should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like a held breath that never fully released. Friends told me I was overthinking it, that stress and isolation can mess with perception. Deep down, I knew stress hadn't opened locked doors or shifted shadows on a screen. Normalcy had come back too cleanly. Winter dragged on, and the snow eventually melted, exposing the yard exactly as it should be. No disturbed soil, no marks along the siding, nothing to point at and say, "That's it, that's the reason." I reviewed the footage one last time before archiving it, forcing myself to watch without jumping ahead. There was a pattern to it, subtle but consistent, always centered around the same hallway and the same interior doors. Never the front door, never the back. It felt less like an intrusion and more like a presence navigating familiar territory. That thought stayed with me longer than I wanted to admit. Houses, after all, remember things better than people do. Eventually, a practical decision replaced speculation. The house went up for sale, and I told myself the move was about space and convenience. Packing up felt like closing a chapter that refused to explain itself. On the final day there, every door stood open, sunlight reaching into corners that had stayed dark before. Walking through those empty rooms, the place looked harmless, almost ordinary. No sounds followed me, no last gesture, no sign of whatever had shared those hours with me. The cameras came down, one by one, and I left them behind with the keys on the counter. The silence didn't follow me out. Now, living somewhere else, working similar hours, winter doesn't carry the same weight it used to. Headphones still come off now and then, just to check the space around me, a habit I doubt will fade. Nothing like that has happened again, and maybe that's the closest thing to an answer I'll get. Some things don't need a name or a face to leave a mark. All I know is that during those hours, something moved through my home without ever showing itself. When I stopped pretending it wasn't happening, it stopped happening too. That's the part I still think about late at night.